So I think that when you get to the second part of the book, he already presents you mathematical of the transcendental. The second part, he already gives you everything kind of tuned and with all these selections and decisions that he made kind of built into the presentation. So you never get this middle presentation, which is easier to do in set theory, right? In being an event, it's kind of straightforward. Mathematical presentation of ZFC and Badiou's use of it in being an event. In logics of worlds, there is like 10 years worth of engagement with category theory, a decision on how it plays into his system, and then a reconstruction, which is very tendentious. So he decides not to use diagrammatic presentations all the way to the end of the book. He decides to begin with frames and locales before he gives you any topos theory. Even topos theory is presented like a restricted version of it without giving you the general version or justifying why he presented the restricted versus the general. So all these decisions are implied. And what I think will be ultimately useful is for us to be able to do the opposite, to be able to present category theory as a general frame, to localize set theory inside of it, which is something that's why I translated the part of immanence of truth, because Badiou already gives you the key. He says, look, I'm ready to accept that the belonging relation is a relation. So is a restriction over the richness of categorical presentation onto one relation. And I think that's crucial because it clarifies that ontology has nothing to do, like to talk about being, you don't need the richest discourse. You need the poorest discourse, weirdly enough. Like it's a really crazy exercise in refining language so that it keeps only one primitive relation, right? Rather than the richness that you could have in terms of morphisms and things like this. So I think that at some point, being able to do this backwards and saying, okay, this is the power of category theory. If you kind of constrain it like crazy, you get a theory of extensional and well-founded multiples. But if you remove that constraint, you get something else. What is that? Well, and then we need a name for that, which I don't think Badiou gives it, because for Badiou, it's also only a part of category theory that actually is a theory of appearing. Category theory in general is not a theory of appearing, right? He gives very specific restrictions on what he calls appearing in the logics of a world, because the logic of a world needs to have a connection with that theory of the multiple, needs to be interiorly connected to constraints over ontology and so on and so forth. So we would need to have like a way of speaking about category theory in general. And I think for Caron, who's interested in the questions of language in Badiou, that would be where the theory of language in Badiou would appear, in my opinion. Now, after all we've discussed, I think that the status of category theory in general for Badiou is something like the status of all, let's say, of the generator of specific languages, right? Depending on how you constrain this machinery, it will give you the language to talk about ontology, which is a classical Boolean world with restriction on belonging and so forth. If you restrict it somewhere in some other way, you get the theory of elementary toposes. Sorry?
Yeah, I'm with you on that. Always very strikes me as very important the fact that, you know, in that Zalamea paper we discussed so many times, he suggests that there is some part of category theory, and he achieves some part of this, is able to formalize, you know, Wittgensteinian language games and things like that. So it is like a region of language that would be at first unformalizable. I mean, I've seen discussions the last days of people saying, why do you want to formalize Wittgenstein's second philosophy? Because the point is that it is not, you can't really formalize it. So I think this is a hasty judgment, really. It's just the fact the thing is you didn't have the formalism at the time for that. So this is almost like a symptom that there is more to be done within category theory with the logics of ordinary language, of natural language. I think there's much more richness to be gained.
Also, something that connects to this and brings us to a discussion we had previously. We discussed, I mean, I'm starting from this thing we talked about, we said, usually you have this sort of distinction between world and language, and there is a bridge here, there's a gap that is unbridgeable between the two, and Badiou wants to propose something where world and language are on the same side, and the way that these things connect have a lot to do with model theory, right? I haven't seen this done anywhere, though I remember a while back we discussed this, and it seemed to, I think Reza found a good quote where this was being said, but that if you generalize the problem, like if model theory talks about you having a system here with a certain set of functions that turn propositions P into propositions Q. And models, they do like this. You have a different system here, and with functions G that turn, let's say, R into S. Sorry, I'm having trouble with for some reason, my iTunes opens by itself and starts playing music. I don't know why. Just a second. And you have this system with its own implicative structure, how its rules for deriving new propositions out of primitive propositions. And what is a model? You encode, let's say, you encode P, it will give you a proposition R. You then apply G to R, which will give you a proposition S. You then decode S, which will give a proposition Q. If applying F to P is the same as applying E to P, sorry, this needs to be written backwards, right? Applying E to P, then applying G to the function E of P, to the encoding, and then decoding this. If going about it, this whole process here commutes with doing this, then this is a model of this, right? And the fact is that, of course, G is not a function. G can be many functions. So the cool thing is that you had here an atomic, like a basic undecomposable process where, for example, P becomes Q with a function that is a black box. It's one function. And here, this one function is substituted for many functions. So G is actually applying G, then H, then W, whatever. So you have like, you decompose the function F into smaller or different functions or more steps. So you learn stuff, you render explicit what was implicit in F. So this process is not tautological, right? Now, what was always a point of discussion in model theory is that the encoding and the decoding are not derivable from S or S2. How you decide to encode S is not part of S. And how you decide to decode S2 is not part of S2. It's not derivable from inside. So it's a theory of functions that would have to be very generalized to account for this whole process. Like the question, what is it that F, D, G, and E have in common? Is a general theory of morphisms.
Yeah.
That is much bigger, larger, and richer than the theory of the derivation within a system. So my impression is that category theory gives you the general language for this. So it makes perfect sense that it is the global theory of this process rather than this process. It also makes perfect sense that, for example, Wittgenstein's accounts of this will now appear here somehow, right? Encoding and decoding has everything to do with as if, or with seeing as. Because seeing as is not a derivable form out of the thing you're seeing. It's an additional thing, which could be changed. You could derive some other way of formalizing. Like if this is, for example, a logical system, this can be a geometrical formalism, but it could also be an algebraic one. And you will learn different things from creating this sort of connection. No wonder that category theory is very closely connected with algebraic topology, thinking about these connections more generally. So I do think that there is an undeveloped theory of why it is that what Badiou wanted to do with concept of model is in fact realized, fully formalized, finally with category theory. Now, this already gives us an insight into the relation between category theory for Badiou and set theory, because set theory will be this for very precise relations, right? Between sets and power sets, but it still is this.
Yep.
Right. So
what I find most interesting is the fact that you are pointing at the very thing that was, Livingstone's objection to the generic orientation of thought, which is you need something extra from the domain and codomain of the operation of the modeling operation in order to specify what kind of modeling, in a sense, not the modeling, but what kind of modeling is going on. So usually these amounted historically to making use of language and of a language of kinds, of types, and things like that. So you are pointing at this kind of medium for getting at these different modeling relationships, which are not exhausted in themselves. You need some medium for doing that. So it seems that category theory can formalize this medium. And I mentioned Livingstone because this was the whole point of the difference between the generic, because it was the generic was a orientation of thought that concentrated on different disciplines and their interiority, right? While the paradoxical critical was an orientation of thought that concentrated upon a universal medium, in a sense, and the inconsistency that comes with a universal medium, which is thought of as being language. So it is interesting that here you are pointing at something that is outside of the model and modeling, that kind of specify the model relationship, that it is not exhausted within the model themselves or the modeling relation itself.
But now that you say, I think that we could definitely do this. Like you have this schema we were talking about, and then you have two solutions to this. The paradoxical critical one is to call both things one system. You call this a system. So you say it is complete. There's nothing outside of it. But now I have the trouble of organizing the relation between these things. And it's an inconsistent relation because this is outside, but is inside.
Yeah.
So you get
and the further problem of relating the bigger
this thing blob, here with the
blob, the bigger one with the ones inside.
The generic one says you don't need to create this big S. All you need is to realize that when you have one system and another, like the limits for this, there will be incomplete things that cannot be mapped, right? I mean, the whole point of Gödel is saying you don't get a complete and consistent system like this if this stuff here is above a certain degree of complexity. right? But Badiou says, no, don't worry about it being complete. You can, it's really good for us that if this is not complete, you need to come up with a bigger system, right? That you need to add new axioms and make
very, because yeah, that's really interesting, because at the same time it seems that Badiou is, at the same time being in a generic position, he also is using all the time the construction, the constructivist, also the constructivist orientation of thought, which sustains the idea of, you know, being necessary to construct bigger and more, you know, what do you say that, there's a word there that escapes me, whatever, but bigger, I mean more powerful frameworks in order to account for what's going on. You don't get to have the whole, as in the paradoxical critical, at once, right?
Yes. And the thing is with the whole, with this idea of a big system here, is that it's not mathematical anymore. It's not formal, right? In this system here, it's totally immanent in this lower here. So my point is that first you get an explanation of why move this way, right? And you already get this construction here with set theory, ZFC plus negation of continuous of the hypothesis of the continuum. It's precisely this mathematics, totally formalized. But you don't get at this point a theory of what this arrow is. Like the theory of this is not included in this. What these arrows are is not expressible in set theory. So you move then, and this is my point, we move to a construction where you go from, you have category theory. Inside category theory, you have a restriction for belonging, which gives you set theory, which gives you this thing here. And then you have this other thing here, which is constructing, we're following here in logics of worlds, which is giving us something else. Right, here's ontology, here's phenomenology. So, but what we're seeing is also a restriction. This is not, let's say, the place of category theory. This is undiscussed. And I think this is where the theory of language, in the sense of the global theory of modeling relations, comes in, which is a general theory of morphism, right? Or whatever you want to call it. So I do think that this is a clue to how to lay, in another point, begin to reconstruct all that we're seeing in a way that it's clearer the order of reasons, because it can be reinscribed in a process that, for example, Reza and I took a long time doing, which is finding the spirit that is in continuity in all the steps that Badiou takes in his career. Because this, for example, clarifies the connection between concept of model and logics of worlds, right? The connection between concept of model and being an event, I think Reza already nailed it in his book. Like you can see that there is a direct connection. The theory of discipline is already clearly a theory of, let's say, immanent modeling and things like this. But to localize all of this with regards to logics of worlds, I think that for now, we've been discussing it too much, and it makes perfect sense because the book prepares us to do so. We've been discussing it too much in terms of an additional layer, and not as a total new view of everything from the standpoint of this enriched machinery, you know, because Badiou himself is very uncertain on how much he wants to give in to this new perspective. And I think only in the end of Immanence of Truth, in that passage that I translated today, he says, you know, guys, being an event is actually like a small region in this bigger machinery. Like, and he starts exploring things that require you to say that the whole large cardinal theory will have an interpretation of belonging that is, let's say, a weaker interpretation, and that is, let's say, decoupled into, let's say, how you construct that primitive. So he gets to a point where he no longer can have belonging as a primitive for his general philosophy, only for ontology. So it has a lot of interesting consequences. But I just wanted to preface all of this because I do feel like personally I'm not there yet, in the sense that I can reconstruct this continuity and organize these things. But I do feel like a lot of what we discussed falls into place when we present things in this way. Like this stupid image that I came up with here already puts into place some of the questions we were talking about. Like I feel like a lot of Caron's questions fall here because they concern this, like where a lot of questions here went. Questions about natural language, the connection between language and being, things like this, right? The connection between a language and other theories of language, which is like a Carnapian problem of logical frames. Like all of that actually falls here, not here where we are studying right now. What we're studying right now is not category theory, is a restricted set of tools from category theory, which restricted in the proper way, just like this restriction over the relation of belonging gives us the machinery we want to talk about phenomenology, right? But the decisions over why we are restricting it the way we are doing comes from philosophy, comes from deciding beforehand that he wants an objective phenomenology where relations are not governing everything. Sure, a world is the differential network, but we're going to restrict that. We're not going to accept, like, let's say you get in Foucault's book on diagrammatic thinking, the Spinozist, Deleuzian network of all networks, and all there is networks with no substance, or substance is relation. He still wants to make sure that this phenomenology is compatible with his ontology, and that this phenomenology, let's say, is materialist, which we'll see it's not a given, right? So I think this helps to locate that there are some questions that fall into this broader uncharted territory, and there are specific questions that fall and that are very much hidden in the book as to why he chose this particular tool. And if you go to Mathematics of the Transcendental, you see that the first part of the book is here, and the second part of the book is here, and we don't understand exactly how this went about, like this selection, right? Why the hell did he choose to present things the way he did? Why did he restrict stuff the way that he restricted? All of that, which goes here, is a bit unclear. So why is everything? Yeah?
And it is interesting in this example, you're saying that in the first part of the book, there are a lot of diagrams and almost no diagram in the second part.
Yes. And Badiou, in that passage that I translated for our website, he says that he was very much worried with a philosophical current that is confirmed by category theory, which uses, let's say, extrapolates from the formal machinery a justification that everything is relation. There's only relations, and that's what it is. Because I think that there is a didactic aspect to forcing you to think through locales, subobject classifiers, local toposes with no diagrams, because then you need to follow the logical constraints that they propose, not so much the visual presentation of, oh, this is all relations between relations. And when you get to that diagrammatic presentation, if you do the job of reconstructing them, you're already, let's say, arriving at it with the pragmatic use of them previously decided. You're not, let's say, speculating over, well, if objects are defined by the arrows, then all there is arrows. He wants to make sure that you're so convinced by the relation between ontology and phenomenology, between multiples and this kind of logical spaces theory, that when you get to the diagrammatic presentation, you're like, okay, no, this is very powerful, but for my purposes, I need this other thing. Like you can make that, I think you can make that selection or that judgment that he himself made. And I think it's very Platonic of being wary of images and preferring to use mathematics in this kind of noetic forcing of yourself outside of images to a domain without images. And I think that category theory can be seductive in that sense, right? Oh, if I can present everything as relations, then ontology is ontology of relations, and that's not a deducible statement, right? You cannot deduce from the fact that you can present set theory categorically that the ontology of the multiple is in fact an ontology of relation. It doesn't follow. So I think he's taking a lot of he's being very attentive to this, not to give too quick a step and lose this restraint. But I think that this makes everything a lot more esoteric, and even for mathematicians who look at this and say, why did you restrict? Like, I've read a bunch of texts by people complaining about logics of worlds. Most of the texts complain that Badiou didn't understand category theory, and that he uses the poorest of the poorest tools that he had. Like, why not say more, right? So if you're already aware that for him, it's not about simply following this stuff wherever it goes, but having strong philosophical decisions and finding ways to explore the consequence of those decisions with fragments of formal theory that are equipped to deal with those decisions and not others, right? Then it makes a bit more sense why this is the path. But I think that it comes with a lot of noise and makes it much harder. So yeah, that's my intro and my excuse to what follows today. It's very not necessarily clear. A lot of what we said last time also changed my mind about the ways that I was understanding certain stuff, but I didn't change it in the PDF, in the slides. So my idea is to change it and perfect it as we go along, so we can also understand it a bit better. So this is the summary of what I understood from last time. I wonder if you guys agree, and if we should add something else to it. So first thing that we did, and I think was very important for me at least, was to clarify something about the status of the multiple T, of the transcendental, right? My first understanding was that when he says that T is a multiple of P's and Q's, that it is an absolutely different multiple existing in the situation, in the same way that if you have, let's say, a bunch of dishes in a restaurant, to keep our preferred example, a mouth is another being in that world, right? So a mouth is totally distinct from the dishes, and transcendentals concern this was a too quick jump from Badiou's presentation of worlds to a theory of measuring and ratios and things like that in an objective sense. Then a lot of what we said last time helped me to see that this is not, T is not necessarily a set composed of degrees P and Q, such that nothing that is in P and Q is also in alpha and beta in that world. It might very well be the case that this is, let's say, a set of relations on this alpha and beta, right? So if we have something like, where is it? Like this, we were talking about last time, there's no need to assume, and it's actually pernicious to assume that this stuff here is a multiple that's extensionally totally distinct from these things. It's better to if you want an intuitive image, it's better to imagine that T is like a structure that works on these things here, and we call P certain relations between these things.
Yeah, and actually, I was reading the end notes, and Badiou explicitly says that T is a subset of M. It's not, it doesn't belong to M.
Ah, he says this.
Yeah.
Which note? Do you know which note that is?
Actually, I think it's the definition. You know, at the end of the book, he.
Okay. Oh, that's crucial. So he says in the definition of transcendental.
You mean the statements, Dennis? There's a statements that are that supposedly present the whole book in the end.
Yeah, no, it's after that. It's in the dictionary.
Okay.
Yes, he says that. Page 596, In formal
Yes.
terms, given a world M, the transcendental of that world is a subset T of that world. So there you go.
So it's not like the mouth, it's more like, or some kind of measuring apparatus that's outside of the things being measured, but rather it's composed of bits of the things being measured.
Exactly. So I think that
still a little bit confusing to me. I mean, if I wanted to continue with what Gabriel was presenting, Miller has these two terminologies in his suture, or the action of a structure, that talks about structured structure and a structuring structure. If the word is structure, then the structured structure are the objects, and the structuring structure is the transcendental.
Yeah, I think that's helpful. But this is the first point. So I thought that we discussed this a lot. Either both what Reza said now, what you also mentioned last time, what Dennis clarified now concerning the multiple T as a subset of M, right? It also already gives you this. It's not like two multiples T and alpha extensionally distinct within M. It's actually that T is a subset of M. So we started debating very quickly through some slides that I presented, the relation between state of situation, or the whole discussion with representation being an event, and the transcendental structure, right? If you guys remember from being an event, but you calls the state of the situation the structure as well, right? So what did we talk about? We said every power set presents an order structure and is in fact a complete halting algebra, but not all pose sets and complete halting algebras are power sets. So, and we wanted to, and this discussion continued in Facebook later on. The question is, what can we learn about the similarities between being an event state on the state of situation and representation, and logics of Rawls' theory of appearance, and about their differences from analyzing the relation between inclusion and order. So I got the impression that last time it was a bit as if with this idea where I tried to show that the power set has an intimate relation with a pose set, that I was trying to deduce the pose set structure and deduce, let's say, the operators of appearing from ontology for Badiou, but that was not the case. It's just that the idea was to propose that this is an interesting inquiry because stuff can come out of it. And I will try to go back to it today a bit as well. Another thing we came up with, which it was a debate on what I call the transcendental slice. In the idea that, for example, let's say that you have a world, and in this world, like this, and the question was, how do we distinguish between, let's say, what we called in last meeting, a transcendental that maps these things into, let's say, 2 or like 5 degrees. You only have like between P and T, and a transcendental that maps the same thing but has more degrees inside. Like between P and Q, which would be the next one, you get an R here. And this idea, let's say, we discussed this in terms of, let's say, resolution or detailing capacity to explore this terrain a bit better based on these distinctions, right? And we said, well, this is not what Badiou calls singularity or event. These things are actually just explorations of the same thing. So we needed a different way to talk about, let's say, the palette of a common person and the palette of a specialist, that didn't necessitate didn't imply that we're talking about different transcendentals, but about, this is what I call different slices of the same transcendental, right? So, for example, that's why Reza meant, look, you have a certain world of a painting. The transcendental is already established for this world. It has all possible values. So if you now distinguish between let's say, a common expectator and an expert expectator, it should be the distinction between, let's say, only being able to account for a couple of measures in this world, or being able to account for even more of the detail of that world. But it's not two different transcendentals. So I'm just trying to kind of sum up the thing that we talked about last time. So examples were sought to discuss what it means to increase one's world in terms of detail and resolution, for becoming an expert, for example. And how is this different from transforming a transcendental? So we talked about that. And I tried hard, but I'm not sure if it was convincing in the end, to talk about the general movement of book 3, because when we look at that, of this image, look at this image here, we can, which we already know is not necessarily the clearest image, but it helps us to see that as we move along chapter 3, we're moving into more and more interior views of a world, right? To the point that when we get to the discussion on atoms, we're talking about the information that is available about the transcendental from the standpoint of local relations between components of an object. So this was, let's say, a general presentation of the transcendental as a general structure, like a locale, and it says a lot about, let's say, how is a general locale structure, or the category of locales, whatever you want to call it. But here is about, okay, how can you explore what's singular about the transcendental of a world at this last point? And this was crucial for how he will reconstruct everything later on. But I wanted to make sure that we follow the idea that the chapter goes in this movement of kind of interiorizing the process and looking for information about these transcendental degrees in the local relations between phenomena, components of phenomena, and so on, right? Because this will be crucial later on. So this is what I called this kind of presentation of the general movement of the book. So my idea was to begin today, before we go on into function of appearing, what is a function of appearing, so on and so forth. I just wanted to give a second go at attempts to think between power sets and the relation between power sets and complete Heyting algebras. So perhaps there is a bit of a punchline today, instead of last time where Reza was left frustrated with the lack of complete thought. But the first time around, what I tried to do was very much just highlight a sort of movement from the power set to the pose set, as if there was some sort of deductive or derivative aspect from power sets to pose set structures and Heyting algebras. After breaking my head with the topic a bit and banging my head against the wall and crying and other humiliating emotions, I came up with and thanks a lot to Dennis as well, let me put the blame on him a bit. I came up with this alternative way of talking about this that I find a bit more satisfactory. So the basic way to approach this is to start again from the same place. So yes, we can talk about a set with a couple of elements, and we know how to arrive at its power set. So we have here the set. The power set will make it so that it includes all the subsets of S, right? And what I focused on last time is that, well, since this subsets, they have some inner relation, because A is both here and here, B is both here and here, so there is an arrow here and an arrow here, and this is both in A and in B, right? I constructed this thing here, and it does obtain a basic ordering structure. What I started to think about a bit more is, okay, let's do the opposite. And rather than try to derive this order structure and everything that, all the operations that come along with it from this operation on subsets, let's do the inverse. Let's imagine that this is the special case, and we're going to generalize it. We want to know what is a general case of constructing order structure. So the first thing I did was to unpack the logical constraint on the power set construction. What does this mean? It means that you can present the way of constructing a power set. So the set that includes all the subsets that are here, by imagining it in very constructive terms as asking a question, yes or no, about the elements of S. So imagine that this arrow here, it asks, is this element X in the subset? How many ways can we answer this question? So here's element A and here's element B, right? A and B. So let's see all the possible answers. Is X, so either A or B, in the subset? In the first case, A is in the subset. Yes. B is in the subset. Yes, that's the subset AB. The second case, A is in the subset. Yes, B is not. This will give you subset A. A is not and B is. Give you subset B, or none of them are. This will give you the null set, right? So we can actually arrive at the rule that there's always 2 elevated to n elements in the power set from the fact that there is always a yes or no question to be asked of all elements. So for every element you have, you can deduce this relation, right? So what you actually get, why is this important? Because this question here is X in the subset. What sort of answers we're going to accept? This is what this thing here is clarifying. We're only going to accept yes or no answers, 1 or 0. Either it is or it is not. So I now define the condition, a logical filtering, if you will, that defines the things that I'm going to accept as subsets. I said, you know, the answer to this question that you're asking, the condition for the answer is that it's either yes or a no. If you give this condition, the answers to the question, how many subsets there are in S, will be 4. Is this clear?
Yes.
Okay. Now, we can relax that condition. So imagine that instead of this Boolean thing that I had there with either yes or no, we have 3 values. No, yes, and nah, a bit, or kinda, or only the, I don't know, you know, like just a bit. So we substitute this 2-value function that we had for a 3-valued one. I forgot to substitute. Here is S, right? Here. To keep as it was. So now imagine that we have 3 possible answers. So the question is the same. This arrow, just to keep it to how it was, the arrow was going this way, right? The question is X in the subset A? So I still have only 2 elements, and I'm going to start answering. I can answer yes and yes, yes and kind of, yes and no. Kind of yes, kind of, and so on and so forth. You see that this stuff here, one thing already happens here. On the one hand, it is ordered. I can kind of distinguish, like If I said yes and yes, this is, let's say, a maximal subset. Everything is there. And if I said no and no, it's a minimal subset. And if I said half and half, it's between maximal and minimal. But what the hell is half and half? I don't have a notion of subset, properly speaking, as elements that moved to the subset. I have an idea, already start having an idea that this is somehow disconnecting elements from the subsets. Subsets are not subsets of elements. They're subset of, let's call it
possibilities.
Objects. Yeah, objects or possibilities, whatever. I'm not talking here in technical terms, but you see that this distinction is appearing, right? Now, this distinction is complete if we now move to this continuous thing, the interval 0 to 1. So sorry, let me put this arrow again this way and ask the question, is X in the subset? Now I can have yes and yes. I can have yes and 0.957 blah, 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 blah inside. I can have one yes, A is, but B is only to a weirdly decimal degree inside. So I came up with a continuous list of values, right? These things now are totally open subsets. I don't know what's inside this subset exactly. So this way of moving, it gave this thing here is actually totally ordered, this thing above. But this thing here, it won't be totally ordered. It will actually have a lattice that is not connected in that strict way. It's a looser connection. But what we got is a mapping that took us from a set composed of specific points, like A and B, to a space composed of open sets, where I don't know, with no points inside. Like, what is actually, let's say, the elements of the degree T, which has 0.3 of A and 0.7 of B? I have no idea. So you see, like, when we generalize the function that took us to the power set, or to the set of subsets, to a function that asks the same question, but with a different way of classifying what counts as a subset, to a continuous set of functions. You get a pointless space. This space has no points because we cannot tell. Let's say if we had to make a kind of a intuitive way, right? If this is a point and this is a point, like let me put them like this, like this is a very dense dot. This is a very dense dot. It's black when it's fully integrated. So the subset AB, like with maximal value, is like these two dots are really there. But the subset T, the degree T, is actually like something like this. I don't have gray. Shit, I thought this would work so nicely. Okay, this program doesn't allow me to have gray, but it's like kind of there. It's like a cloud, a fuzzy cloud, because they're not very much there. So we kind of dissolve points into this gradient space, because things here are only 0.3 and 0.7 inside. They're no longer either inside or not.
Yeah, I would just add here that actually the top table is also partially ordered, because like in the table V and T, right? The one that's A is 1 and B is 1/2 and 1/2 and 1. those can't be ordered.
Ah, okay. So this is not totally ordered.
Yeah, they're both partially ordered.
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know where I went wrong. I used an example that is slightly different, and I assumed that the condition would hold. Okay. So forget about this.
Yeah, but your point still stands that the general like fuzziness is controlled by the sub-object classifier.
Yes, this is what, now you see how suddenly it makes sense. So sub-object, why not subset? Because we no longer have the idea of sets necessarily. Like it won't be elements of a set. It will be sub something. Therefore, sub-object, why not? Classifier, because it's giving you the condition for how this stuff actually goes this way. Right? So I hope this makes some sense to you guys because it's starting to make a bit of sense to me. But why is this crucial? And I'm starting to look into this. So the first point is degrees in P for T, like P that belong to T, they are pointless. They don't relate directly to elements. So we won't be able to understand what atomic logic is and why it's cool if we don't understand that before we arrive at the question of what is a point in this algebraic topological stuff, that we first dissolve the point when we arrive here, right? This is a dissolving process. Here we have the inner structure. All we have, and this is a lot, we have all the information of how these things relate. We can always ask, well, if I know V and I know T, I can ask the question, is V smaller or bigger than T? What is the envelope of this region here, UTS? I can ask those questions, right? I can evaluate, but that doesn't mean that any of the information about the points as points is maintained. You preserve the information, which becomes this order structure, but you don't preserve the set theoretic discrimination of points as discrete elements in a set. So it's a sort of dissolving operation. That's why when we start asking about how do we move from degrees back to elements, what is below this thing? This is a cool question because this thing here before didn't necessarily preserve points, right? I think somebody is.
Somebody's got their mic unmuted.
Last এই দুটো সেমিস্টারের জন্য অনেক টাকা খরচ করতে হবে 2 লক্ষ করে 4 লক্ষ
Levin, do you mind if we mute your microphone?
I think you can mute him.
I did. I thought it would be rude. Anyway, so I just want to make sure that the point of pointless topology starts to make a bit more sense. And you see, we're moving in the backwards direction that I wanted to move in the first presentation, where it did seem a bit like I was trying to derive something about posets out of the power set discussion, where the point is that when you generalize the function that takes you from set to subsets, and you generalize it by realizing that there is this logical determinant inside of it, you arrive at a more and more pointless space where subsets are no longer composed of determinate elements of the set, but are just, let's say, kind of vague regions, open subsets of that original set. Now, something that I'm interested in, I'm starting to look into, is that there is this very important thing called stone duality. Stone duality says that there is a necessary connection between what they call sober spaces. I love the, I mean, category theory is much more humorous than set theory. Like set theory, everything is so serious and, you know, technical, and category theory, like you have skeletons and sober spaces and full and faithful functors or whatever. Like people are
what was that thing that Eduardo Ox was talking about? The evil something, evil mortis or something like that.
The evil functor.
Evil functor.
I mean, I thought he was making it up, but he said, no, this is a serious name. So, but what are sober spaces? Sober spaces are just precisely what we were looking before. This way of moving from sets or to topological spaces composed of discontinuous functions. So it's precisely this way of dissolving, let's say, points into this pointless space, right? Open subsets. So the category of sober spaces, which is a topological category, right here, functions that move from this to this. This, it says, is the same as the category of frames. Frames is just another name for a locale, right? Frames is like the quantitative approach to the spatial thing that is a locale. So there is this move from a set to the space of evaluating its subsets through continuous functions. This is connected to the space of locales, which is that complete Heiting algebra thing that we were talking about. Should I look into the chat? Can anyone recommend a good introduction? Oh man.
So in your example, this is partially ordered Heiting algebra. So it's not a complete Heiting algebra, is it?
No, it is a complete Heiting algebra. Yeah, it's a partially ordered set and a complete.
It's a poset, okay.
Yeah,
so
sorry.
It is a completely ordered Heiting algebra. It has all the 6 properties of Heiting algebra.
Yeah, it's more than that, right? Because at this level, and this is what I really want to get at the end. We lost something when we arrive at this point, right? We lost points. It's pointless. But we gained like a very robust structure. So the same move that, let's say, dissolved points is equivalent to, let's say, gaining this inner structured space that in fact captures a lot of relations, like it captures the structure here, but with no reference to this, because I can't tell what this corresponds to in terms of elements.
So yeah, because it is relations between the elements.
Exactly. Okay, at this point here, I'm not even going into Badiou's particular function, because what I'm doing here is not an ID. I'm just talking about a given function, whatever, that moves an element to a subset here.
Yeah, I get that. But the way that for me,
both, right?
For me, the way to think about what Badiou does to translate it to this is ontology is a pointed discourse. It talks about points, whereas appearing is talking about those points in relation to each other. So when things appear in a world, they appear through a certain relationship. That relationship is understood. That relationship that is embedded in that appearing is a complete Heiting algebra.
Yeah, but I think that what we need to be careful is that the idea of relation between the points implies, let's say, if we take it too set theoretically or too classically or too Boolean-y, it means that I have A and B and I'm relating A and B. But that's not what is inside here, because I can have 8.9A, right? And 0.8887B. Like, this is not a relation between points. This is also, it's creating what substitutes a point. So I understand what you're saying and I agree with you. I think that's it, but I would be careful there. I think that making sure we realize what we lost, what has disappeared in this move is important, because that's why ultimately if this is Boolean, if this is 1 or 0, everything that will be inside the set of subsets, what we call a power set, will be things that include the elements. And this is what we call representation. If we move here with something which is not Boolean, so if we consider this as a less strict, as a weakening of that condition, we move into a space where these things are not composing. It's much better for me to call it V and to know that there is some stuff inside that it's pointless, and that V relates to some other stuff called T, but I don't have the ontological counterpart in terms of elements. And this general condition is what he calls appearance. And what I realized is that this makes perfect sense, because isn't representation a semantic relation or an aboutness relation to the world, where the thing represented is supposed to capture the being of what was represented, whereas appearance is a relation to being, where the thing that is referring to being is not necessarily the being of it. You just captured that being with relation to other things appearing, but I didn't capture the element inside. So we can actually develop a theory of the difference between appearance and representation using this. But what I wanted to get at, just to conclude this short excursus, is that I think it finally helps us a bit with what we were talking about last time. So this is just a reproduction of the thing I drew in the last slide.
Yeah, that last difference is very crucial.
Yes, and I came up with a way. I think this summarizes
you lose in appearance. You lose the being.
Yes, that's what I wanted to make sure that we understand, that in appearance you lose the being, because what's preserved is the relation between beings. That information is all preserved here in these degrees, but they are called degrees because we lose them the subset, our subobject classifier, to accept like very loose very loose, vague, dissolved parts of sets, so that we only have degrees that connect open sets. But the open sets, what's inside the open set, it's not preserved. So that's the first point, right? So to move from this to this, to be sober about appearance, to make the categorical joke, is to know that in this movement, you now have open sets, which are the result of continuous functions. So you can't really extract the elements back from this. But you also get, let's say, an inner structure of relations that captures all the information you need anyway. So this information will not be totally disjunct from the set. Look, AB is coding this. Without there being A and B in the set A, the answer to these questions that give us the order structure will be totally different. So ontology is influencing this, but this subobject classifier is influencing that we don't know how these constraints relate. Like this gets lost in a certain way by this openness. But this is the first part. The second part that I wanted to propose is that we start to distinguish in our terminology between the evaluation, which is what is going on here, right? We don't know. We know this ordering probe into this ordering. This gives you the value of these relations. But we don't know much more than this. This is infinite. This is between u and t. Nothing guarantees me that there is not some x here that I don't know. This is not that first drawing about the world with the transcendental and the idea that it's already, the transcendental is already all the relations in it. And we wanted to be able to talk about the bad palette versus the good palette.
Exactly.
So I'm proposing the distinction between evaluation to talk about the fact that for every element A in A, there is a degree P, which can be defined by its relation to other degrees in the frame V, which is this. So this is the evaluation structure. But this is a topology. It doesn't give you, you still need to, let's say, translate it back to some classical set, for example. For example, this here has all these continuous values. It's all this spatialized information, right? I can now come up with a set M that is isomorphic to a slice of this. So for example, it contains inside of itself a bunch of real numbers, right? Like things like this. Well, these numbers can help me to measure this because the relation between this number n and this number n line will present the same order structure as the relation that were already evaluated by the transcendental. So we can distinguish between measuring and evaluating. The evaluation is the transcendental structure. The measuring is how you navigate the evaluation structure. And this requires you to have some level of similar ordering or isomorphic structure between the two. So the thing that I wanted to include, like the mouth with the palate, right? It actually comes at this bottom here. And it, let's say, is able to probe into this thing here. But perhaps not all of it, because it's not a good palate, because it's genetically bad or it's untrained. Doesn't matter, right? But then we can start distinguishing between these two things. Let's say instantiations of the frame, of a slice of the frame in a discrete or finite multiple, and the actual evaluative structure that governs this question in general. Does this make sense to you guys?
You lost me in part of this, so let me repeat what you said. So first, let me roll back to this topological space. So if the interval of all the possible values for which points in set A find a degree of a relation to each other is 0 to 1, then we are talking about a topological matrix of every possible combination of values within the interval 0 to 1 for the elements A, B, which is your partially ordered set on the right. So can I mark this? How do I mark this?
There's a function annotate.
There is a.
It's at the top if you go view options. I was going to say, though, there's no guarantee that every one of these subsets exists. So I think that should be made clear.
Yeah.
So my point was this, that a given world, in a given world, some of these options may exist. Some of these options, like for example, these 3 rows may exist in a particular world, and in another particular world, these 3 rows may exist. Right?
Exactly. Although the minimum and the maximum must always exist.
Minimum and a maximum must always exist per world. So, so we are not saying, you're saying what I thought you were saying. So this, the entire thing, how do you delete this? Undo. So when you talk about the whole thing, you are talking about what makes sense to a particular world in general. Okay. Now, within this world that has these values, you call this as this topological space, the space of evaluation, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you say a space of measurement is what? A subset of this?
Not a subset, but is, let's say, this is transcendentally given, right?
Yeah.
So what does it mean to actually measure something? Transcendentally, I swear that that's what we're doing. So what does it mean to actually concretely measure something? It means to find an actual multiple that has as its structure at least a part of this structure. So, for example, let's imagine it like this. This is a wall, right? And this is all the evaluative structure of points in this wall. So this is an infinite set of points. This is this general kind of space of open sets that have some relation inside of them, some structure, but we don't know what it is. What does it mean to measure something in this, based on these evaluations or in accordance to these evaluations? It means to find a way to map this into something like something that has a being in accordance to it. Right? So, for example, in this space, it is true that, I don't know, the maximal subset that includes the whole part of the wall is here. The no distance is here, but I don't know all the information here because there is a lot of information. If I have a ruler where the unit of that ruler is 1 centimeter, I'll be able to collect, this will be isomorphic, let's say, to getting some of the relations between these values in a set that has this, actually it's not a real, it's a natural integers, between 1, 2, 3, 4. Some of these values can be mapped onto concrete particular values. If I now have a ruler with a unit of 1 millimeter, I can learn about the wall much better because perhaps in the transcendental, in fact, it wasn't such a smooth wall. It was full of details. So when I actually measure 1 millimeter per millimeter, I can learn stuff that is not given by the 1 centimeter ruler. Because the relations between this stuff here in this ruler, this 1 centimeter ruler, will explore this space, will take a slice of it, more information than the other ruler. So my way of thinking about this is that measurements concern not only the evaluative space, which is not yet measured, not yet defined, it's not instantiated in anything, but there might be multiple ways of doing this. For example, if I have a menu of a restaurant that has put some names of dishes under a certain heading, puts other names of dishes under a certain heading, this is a basic formal structure where you have subsets of dishes, right? So if this thing is in accordance with a bit of information here, for example, it's true that the envelope of the measure for certain dishes is, I don't know, a certain level, and the measurement, the envelope for other dishes is another measure. makes sense that this is isomorphic to separating these dishes as it is in the menu. But let's say that you are a critique and you're a food critic and you're gonna critique the food in much more detailed ways. There will be other ways of measuring the food that are more detailed and that capture more information than the menu. Because you determine them, let's say, in terms of spiciness, as we use last time, saltiness, sweetness, and so on. So you explore this space much better. So what I'm trying to distinguish is between the actual evaluative structure,
which is the space of all possibilities.
Which is the space of all possible, exactly.
I have a question, like a silly question about the vocabulary. Why are you using evaluation and measure as you are using? Is this consistent with Badiou's use of this vocabulary? Do you think?
I can explain this. This is consistent with the project that Dennis and I are trying to develop, where we want to separate value and price.
Okay.
So we want to be able to talk about value as, let's say, the space of all possible relations between commodities, a space where the actual being of the commodity is in fact dissolved into these relations. Everything you know about commodities is based on that X of A equals Y of B commodities and so on, and or Z of C and so on and so forth, right? But you don't have a measure for these relations yet. Just because they're all connected in certain proportions doesn't mean you know how to express value. This is a value invariance. So what the liberal theory of price does is at least to recognize that price structures are actually information structures about what's going on in the market. They don't have a clear view of value invariance because they don't have a good measure theory, but still, this is where price comes in as a concrete chain, not as the global chain, but a concrete one, right? The name of this is the transformation problem. It's an open problem in Marxist theory, and Dennis is going to solve it, and I'm going to sign my name next to him.
Just asking because.
Hey Dennis, are you taking other names? Put my names too.
We'll just add everyone in this meeting.
Yeah.
Joint project.
But just because it's not really consistent with the discussion we had about Hegel, because for Hegel it seems measure is the evaluation more than what you are calling measure now. But it's okay, you don't have to be.
Yeah, I'm not, but I do think it's consistent with Badiou, because Badiou almost never uses measure. He almost always uses evaluation.
Yeah, you're right.
And I was the one who forced the two things together. So it's consistent with him, I think.
Yeah.
Right. And I think this is very crucial because a very nice study would be, for example, the fact that you can have fractal evaluative spaces, which imply that the measurements are not convergent, right? So fractal spaces will be spaces where it's in fact a geometrical property, right? It's precisely one where these continuous functions are not converging in a certain way. This topological space is very, very particular. But in a fractal space, so for example, imagine this is the coast of England, which is the example Mandelbrot gives, right? Sure, there is something like the fractal structure of this space, fractal structure. But if you try to measure it, if you use the 1 kilometer rule and you come here and you measure the space using a 1 kilometer ruler, you will get, say, I have no idea, I'm terrible with numbers. Let's say it's a 10,000 kilometer coast. Now let's say you lower this ruler to 1 centimeter ruler. Rather than give you like this very, very broad strokey kind of resolution of the coast like this, it will give you a very detailed kind of thing like this that will go inside all the small spaces of the coast, right? The consequence of this is that the number that you will get here is like 30,000. And if you go smaller to n millimeter, 1 millimeter, the number will also not converge. Like it will give like 70,000. So you don't get converging measures, even though the evaluative space is structured. So fractal geometry is very nice to realize that you can have a consistent evaluative space and you can have incompatible measure structures. So it's good to have that distinction, you know?
Yeah,
So,
yeah. No, I'm not really questioning the need for the distinction. I think it's pretty straightforward, and even in the way Hegel talks about measure, I think it's kind of confusing because he's using measure either for the intrinsic values of, you know, what we are calling a transcendental, and for, you know, the act of measuring something with some arbitrary units. So he uses measure for both, which is kind of confusing when you read the chapter on measure in Science of Logic. But I was just clarifying from where
yeah,
this.
actually. But yeah, I mentioned this last point just because I know we both are interested in how do you formalize scale intransitivity. And I think that a good way to do it, and of course, it's I'm not well versed in this, but I have the impression that fractal spaces have something to do with the fact that the evaluation of these degrees at different levels of detail, the envelopes of this, like the branches of this partial order, they are very counterintuitive because this will give you a branch at a different scale than this branch. So even though this is inside of this, they are uncomparable. You see my point? Like
Yep.
you have like Euclidean classic structures here and here as well, but they are actually incomparable between them. So if you get a measure that captures something of this, you're missing out on this and vice versa. I don't know, that's how I'm thinking about it, but I'm not sure if it's the proper way.
Another thing to add to this is that the material difference, the thing that really makes this different isn't actually inside of M. At least if we try to develop this in a categoric way, M and V actually look quite similar.
You mean this and this?
Yeah. Especially because since you're talking about the open interval between 0 and 1, you know, any subset of that is isomorphic to it, right? Any subset of the real line is isomorphic to the entire real line.
Yeah.
Oh, I guess if it's compact, like there's no gaps in it. So really the V and M look very similar. The difference is in how it's indexed, how A is indexed on both of them. In the first case, A is indexed on B in such a way that you create this complete hiding algebra, which is a partial order, but you can also index A on V or some other subset of V such that it's totally ordered.
Yes. That's crucial. So you would say that the move from what is at stake here is the difference between the post set and a completely ordered set.
No, I think what Dennis, are you saying that, so in order to ask that question from Dennis, let me ask this question. The difference between, is there a difference between M and V by having, if you wanted to complete this picture, by having a subset of the interval 0, 1 written inside M?
Yeah, no, I'm saying that V is already totally ordered, in a sense, because the real line, the interval between 0 and 1, I mean, it is ordered, right?
Yeah, V is totally ordered, but not the indexing of A over V. So that table is not totally ordered.
Yeah, exactly. But where does the table come from? The table comes from the maps from A to.
Like you said, it's an index of A and B according to the interval 0, 1.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah, but there's many indexes. There's many possible indexes, right?
infinitely many possible indexes. So my question to both of you is whether in order to complete this picture, now you have M, the measure. Is the measure as an isomorphic set to V has a smaller interval between 0 and 1, like the centimeter or millimeter that Gabriel was making an example. So for example, instead of 0 to 1, you have all the rational values as opposed to irrational values. So all the rational values between 0 and 1 is your measuring stick within M.
Yeah, no, I don't think, well, my point is, yes, M can be different like that. It can be like, let's say, rationals versus the reals. But my point is that the information content of this table does not lie inside of the object V. The object V only, the only information V contains is the real line.
Yes.
It does not contain whether A is mapped to 1 and B is mapped to 0.87 and so on. Though that information is contained in the arrow. The map.
Actually, I think I did something wrong here, which is V should be here, right? This is the locale.
Yeah.
This is the object classifier, sorry.
Exactly. Yes, I see what you mean. Then, yeah, V is the order structure. Then it is not the classifier. So M is also, it doesn't really matter if M looks like the current subobject classifier or some other subobject classifier. What matters is the order structure that it induces on A, which is a more subtle point. Like the order structure is characterized by a different thing which is not in any of the objects of the category. So we can't find it, we can't look for that order structure by looking in M or V, or this omega symbol now. The order structure is somewhere else.
Yeah, the reason why I'm saying this, also, I think that this way of presenting stuff makes it a much more harmonious to what measure theory actually is. Measure theory is
sorry, go ahead.
Because measure theory is very much concerned, for example, with if this is composed of, if this was the output, right, or the effect of continuous functions, what does it mean? How are the reals ordered? So this is not, okay, we used here the interval to define this way of this subobject classifier. It's classifying continuous functions, right? Okay, but let's say I have.
Is that your term? You guys invented subobject classifier?
No. It's a standard term. But for example, now the question is, how much information about this can a certain chain of rational numbers have, or how are the ways you can organize the real numbers? So Borel measures, all those discussions on move from continuous to discrete, right? And how do you preserve information from the continuous to the discrete? They are very much a problem for measure theory. So I just find it, I mean, of course, I don't know all the details here, but I find it that it's already very satisfying that if we distinguish this evaluative structure, and all we know from it is that the fact that this is coming here through continuous functions is giving us open sets, and it's giving us a structured space, but without giving us information about the points, right? It's all these relations here, but it's very dense. This opens the question, okay, but what sort of Because to say, okay, this is isomorphic to the real line. Sure, but this is only the beginning of the problem. So if you have here a section of the real line, it's just substituting the same problem for itself, right? The fact that these two things here are similar. Because still, to measure is not to simply index something to the real line. The real line is dense. For every two stuff that you have, two numbers you get from it, there's a number in between, right? So you still need to move from the continuous to the discrete. And this is where we'll later on get to the theory of points. That's why this is good, because we want to understand what is other ways of classifying, as Dennis was saying, that do capture important relations between these things here. Even though it's not going to be continuous, it's again going to be classical and discrete in a certain sense, right? And so on and so forth. So at least the fact that we're coming, like this problem of moving from the continuous to the discrete, how am I going to index this here, right? How is this structure going to explore the relations from that structure? This concerns measurement, but how these points are organized in this ordering structure, that concerns something else, their evaluation, which is not the same.
The fact that the measuring set is discrete, whereas V is dense, does not defy isomorphism.
No, I mean, it doesn't mean that this set is discrete. I mean, I'm just saying that measure theory has this problem, right? It's not going to be, but what I wanted to show here is that, okay, it needs to capture some information about V.
Okay, yeah.
But yeah, there's a lot to develop there. I just think that making this distinction is useful for us.
Different degrees of discreteness give us, so let us say, the problem that we were discussing about the palettes, the different palettes, that kind of.
Yeah, I think it already starts to organize that discussion a bit better.
Resolution in the transcendentals, yeah.
Yeah, and the thing is that, but you will also suggest that infinite works are better measures for infinite worlds than finite ones. So ultimately, what we'll see as a weird development here is that infinite works, which is what's at stake in generic procedures, are better ways of exploring this infinite structure than finite ones. That's why ultimately, let's say politics is a better measure for how value works in political world than, I don't know, the set of all ID numbers of citizens in a country or something like this, right?
Is it because it converge more, I mean, closely because of the infinite character of the...
Yeah, because the inquiries will be able to organize to inquire more into the transcendental than other ways of doing this measuring, I think.
This was awesome.
Okay. So going back to the book finally after this big interlude. So at the beginning of the chapter, Badiou presents this thing that he calls the function of appearing. And it's he defines it, I'm just going to read this. So function of appearing, that which measures the identity of appearance of two beings in a world. To this end, we assume that a transcendental exists in this demonstration situation of being, with all operational properties that we already accorded to the transcendental. It is this transcendental which fixes the values of identity between any two beings of the world. To every pair of beings which belong to this world is ascribed a transcendental degree, which measures the identity of the two beings in appearance. Sorry, what's going on? Okay, shoot. What's going on? I love how my computer just goes crazy. Okay. So he calls function of appearing that which measures the identity of appearance of two beings in a world to every pair of beings which belong to this world, describe the transcendental degree, which measures the identity of the two beings in appearance. So the first difference here that I think is worth mentioning is that rather than that simple thing that we were talking about like this, since it measures the degree of two beings, it's actually something like this, right? A times A to T. So it gets two elements of A and indexes it to a degree P of T. So it's not simply a element here and a degree P. It's two elements to a degree P, right? So that's already a difference from what we were saying before. If this degree is P, we will say that they are P identical. If this degree is the minimum, the maximum, and that they are absolutely identical. If it's the minimum mu, that they are entirely different, and so on. So function of appearing and transcendental indexing is the same for me. Did anyone say something? Sorry. Okay. Yeah, as I'm totally illiterate in category theory, but I was interested, as I said in the beginning of the discussion, on kind of reconstructing all this stuff that he presents in Logics of World from a more kind of natural diagrammatic presentation. I think that a good exercise that we could do at some point is constructing how this is actually, how do we write this function, right? This mapping fully as a diagram. I have no idea how to, but that's part of the thing I wanted a bit more time to work on. Okay, so we get to his example, and I think that since my idea is to use the example extensively, I thought of going through it with you guys, like the whole discussion, the whole presentation, which I liked a lot. I think this is one of the most successful examples of the book, in fact. So my idea was to
the successful example of the book.
No, I like the one with the stars and the constellations, and
I like the painting too.
The painting is nice. It's just the most boring painting ever. But why did he choose the most stupid painting ever painted? But okay, not stupid, but come on. I mean,
a picture of it is on his wall in his office.
Ah, really?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like a personal thing. He like loves this painting.
Oh my God! I'm sure there is a personal story behind it. But anyway, so just to go through the details so we can use the detail later on when we talk. Take a world, for instance, the slow constitution of a demonstration at the Place de la République. Since the demonstration brings together very disparate political forces and organizations, we will ask ourselves how these forces and organizations appear in the gradual filling of the esplanade by thousands of people. So the question is, he already gives us a question that the machinery is supposed to help us think through. How they appear in the gradual filling of the esplanade. So he says an ontological eye only sees a rather indistinct multiple. Men and women, banner posts, discussions, sound checks, newspaper vendors. But it is not this indistinct people which really has the power to appear in the singular process of a demonstration. In the world, demonstration in the making. For a more phenomenological eye, so not the ontological eye, but now this new way of seeing, there are significant differences which alone can really articulate the place, the people, the newspapers, the banners, the slogans in the world in question. For instance, the two loudspeakers heard from a distance seem to below identically. Was this perhaps below?
Below means sound.
Ah, okay. They below identically. The loudspeaker fact does not allow difference to appear at all. Similarly, two groups of very young people, high school students perhaps, have identical ways of treading on the mud with their suction cup trainers. And he says it has recently rained. Of laughing or of speaking too fast, swallowing vowels as though they are scalding chestnuts. But already a flag of a certain red over there, over here, and one of a certain black over there, tell us, let's make this hypothesis, that once again, the demo appearing has brought together those bitter and fraternal adversaries, the heirs of Lenin and those of Bakunin, the communists and the anarchists. Further away, those lean gentlemen, busily intent on their phones, could very well be agents from the intelligence service of the Ministry of the Interior, a compulsory fragment of what appears in such a world. And those big girls over there, many of them African, leaning against the statue, employees of a fast food restaurant. Let's not forget the statue itself, which holding its timeless olive branch above this agitation, seems a little too benedictory, a little too certain of being above all of this, like the Republic is in France. And then he says, to the extent that these multiple beings partake in the world, they differ more or less. When all is said and done, the innumerable joy of their strong identities, loudspeakers, steps, clapping ranks, and of their equally pronounced differences, the red or black flags, the snaking cops, the cadence of the ethical djembe drums over against the miserabilist slogans of threadbare unions and so on, is that which constitutes the world as being there of the people and things which are incessantly intermingled within it. So as a very vulgar representation, which in 10 seconds of analysis already becomes impossible, because this is really not proper way of thinking about these things, because this way of kind of Venn diagramming your way out of the problem is not very good, because it's hard to represent as a sort of sets inside of sets and things like this, structures of more or less, or even transitive or recursive sets within sets within sets, things like this. They're not very clearly in this, they don't appear very clearly, or they're not very easily representable in this way, right? But just so we begin with this, it's easier to talk about stuff. So I just drew a bunch of the stuff that he mentions in this description in this little world of a demonstration in the making. And already, I mean, it's useful for us to see what the hell this whole discussion we were having is useful for, right? He says, he makes a distinction between an ontological I and what he calls a phenomenological one, which I already lost where it's written here. For a more phenomenological I, we want to talk about significant differences. We want to talk about this more or less. We don't want to talk about this as an indistinct multiple where things are either there or they're not there. And that's it. That's all we can say, right? We want to be able to talk about how are these things related? Why are they different? Why are they relevant? How relevant is their difference? Things like this, right? So, for example, he says, to start clarifying what he means, he says, for example, the groups of young high school students are sufficiently indistinct in their pre-demonstration behavior that given two of these groups, those of the Lycée Buffon and those of the Lycée Michelet, for instance, it is tempting to say that their identity is equal to the maximum of the transcendental order. On the contrary, we could believe in the utter non-identity of the post-Bolshevik red flags and the post-Kronstadt black flags. So just to say, let's say the kids from the high school 1 and the kids from the high school 2, they map onto a maximal degree, whereas the red flag and its identity with the black flag maps to a very low degree, right? And at the same time, two red flags map together to a very high degree. So if we have that space there, right, we call this A, this world. This is telling us this idea, this transcendental indexing function that takes every two things here and maps them, that if you take one of them, and another of them and maps them into T, it will give you these different values that tell you they differ more or less, they're closer together, further away, and so on and so forth, right? I think that the whole discussion that we had before, it's useful because now you get the idea that just because you know how you have a, let's say, an evaluative measure to how distinct things are, it doesn't mean you know why they are distinct, how they are distinct. You just know they are distinct, right? And then he takes another example just to conclude. Take a red flag, for example. If you consider it as a phenomenon, it will be differentially compared not only to the black flags, of course, but with other red flags. Perhaps this time the transcendental indexing of identity approaches the maximum. And finally, with everything that appears in the way of emblems, placards, banners, and graffiti, but also the absence of such emblems. Like this closed shuttered window on the 4th floor of an affluent apartment building, which, overlooking the crowd, seems to be saying that it is the bearer of a hostile absence, of non-appearing in this variegated world, that it is irreducibly refractory to the flags of disorder, so that in all likelihood we have a new transcendental value for the identity between the window and any of the red flags. So that's why I wrote here, let's say the closed window and the red flags, which between them are maximal, they have a minimal degree of identity, right? Okay.
What's kind of interesting, I'm not sure if this is a problem really, is the fact that he's using different transcendentals in order to measure different elements of the picture he's painting.
But what do you mean different transcendental?
Yeah, it seems, for instance, the flags are evaluated by their, what they represent and what the people they represent think themselves as. And the students are measured by the fact that they are students even from different lycees, something like that. So it seems that there are different criteria at place, right? I'm not sure this is really a problem, but I mean, there are different criteria doing the measurements, which illustrates the fact that within any multiple situation you can have different degrees, different transcendental degrees going on. I mean, not within the same transcendental, but you can slice the situation with different criteria, right?
But I'm not sure I understand, because when he says here, for example, take the high school students, they are sufficiently indistinct. He didn't say why. They're sufficiently indistinct that the fact that they come from two different schools is not very relevant to distinguish them.
Yeah.
But he didn't say what the criteria is.
Yeah, but
maybe different uniforms.
Sorry, what you're saying, rather?
Maybe different uniforms.
But that's the point. The uniforms, though they're different, they're not distinguishing the students, right?
In the word of appearing, it depends. And later on, we will see. It depends what predicate you use. Like if you, for example, use the predicate, let's say that he doesn't say that, but we are just making this up. Maybe the one group of the students have a white uniform and the other one has a black uniform. Then depending on the predicate, you can say, for example, everybody who's coming in a white uniform, then for this predicate, the component you're making has minimal degree of identity between high school student 1 and high school student 2, whereas it has high degree of identity between high school student 1 and the nurse.
Look, but I think that it's very important to realize that the whole point of what we're doing is to show, for example, that if we were now to compare uniform 2 with uniform 1, sure, they wouldn't be maximally identical if you were into the fine grain of it, even politically. For example, this school comes from the suburbs, this comes from the center. So it's a degree P of identity, it's not maximum. but the appearance of this degree needs to be coherent with this identity. So even if you can go into a finer level of distinction, this has nothing to do, this will not affect the global coherence of what we're seeing. This is crucial. Like, I don't think that what I would, again, I think a slightly different, more precise language would be important to say that we are, let's say, starting with a very low resolution of analysis of differences, but they are all coherent with themselves. Like, these are not different transcendentals, as you said.
Yeah, I do think they are.
But why? The transcendental is the transcendental of a demonstration.
Yeah, I'm not sure there's such a thing. I think there are several.
What do you mean?
There are several.
What are you calling transcendental then?
I mean,
the
multiple that is measuring the degree of I mean the subset, which is a multiple within the situation that is measuring the degree of the others multiples within the situation.
I don't
but you mean, I mean, you can compare black flag and red flag, associating a degree to its colors alone.
But that's another world. That's the world of beautiful colors in the. You're not really considering the fact that blacks are anarchists and red are communists. I mean, it's very clear in everything that is going on here that it's always about the becoming of the demonstration. So it's not about. I don't see. I mean, I think that what you're all. I have the impression that the fact that here, high school, I mean, the way I see it is that high school students that for the demonstration are quite indistinct, even though they are coming from different post-Bolshevik flags. And
yes, understand. I mean, you're saying that the criteria is the becoming of the demonstration. So by this criteria, it makes sense to assign a certain transcendental degree to the closed window, for instance, which is something mysterious. If you, I mean, by comparing it to the red flag, for instance, which would be mysterious to do with other criteria. Okay, good.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. If the criteria is becoming of the demonstration, qua demonstration, okay, but yeah.
But look, I agree with you. This doesn't. Let's say if we were, let's say, a painter painting this scene as it's happening. For example, the fact that the red flag is very similar to the uniform of this school and not similar to this uniform of this school.
Yeah, for instance.
Right? This would give us a maximal degree. For example, this would, I don't know, register in a way, while these things here would register a much lower degree.
Of course. Right? This one, I mean, you're slicing it differently. You're slicing.
No, but that's not a different slice. That's a different transcendental altogether.
Yeah, this is what I'm saying. I mean, the different transcendental is a different slice of something that is presenting itself.
But no, it's not a different slice. I mean, if we keep to the terms that we organized before, slice concerns how you measure an evaluative system, but always the same. What you're talking about is actually a different evaluative system where it's not political relations that count between collectives of people, but relations of color and sensibility. That's a different transcendental, even though perhaps there are some similarities, because for the police coming into the demonstration, for example, suddenly it doesn't matter if you're a communist or an anarchist, if you're white or black, it will make all the difference how you experience the violence. So these things might be superimposed, right?
Yeah, just one point here. I think we can agree that this is prior to any semantic interpretation.
Yes, that's what I wanted to get.
Because the only formal condition that Badiou imposes on the identity function at this point is the triangle. Well, two things. One is symmetry, right? So if you swap the parameters of the identity function, you get the same degree. And then the second condition is the triangle inequality, which actually suggests that it is one evaluative system.
Yes, I think this
Right.
is the crucial part. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, because this is the, I mean, this to make clear what we're getting at with all of this, right? Because what we're actually trying to find, just to go back to the previous slide, is a way of approaching this where the coherence between evaluations. So whatever I take in of these two A's and mapping to T, the coherence is preserved. So the information is preserved so that when I study the relations inside, even though I can continue to evaluate different, this information is preserved. So if you evaluated this flag and this flag for, and then you evaluated the high schoolers, and then you evaluate the high schoolers with the flag, and then the uniforms with the flag, I don't know, whatever is the order you're doing, all we're trying to do is to find, I think Dennis said something very important, it's asemantic, it's prior to a semantic content, internal coherence that will allow us to, let's say, build on top of this, right? So just to move along and connect with that point. So what we have here is this function, right? We already saw how the degrees, the axioms or the basic structure of a complete Heyting algebra. So you have all the ways of organizing conjunction, envelopes, so on and so forth. But Badiou says, look, there are some axioms of this function of appearing, which are already, let's say, ways of looking back at the relations between the things we're measuring and seeing that some things are preserved while we're doing these measurings or these evaluations, right? So the first thing he says is the symmetric thing. So the ID of X and Y is equal to the ID of Y and X, right? So if I, for example, the identity of the red flag one with regard to the black flag, so the identity of this red flag with this black one is equivalent, is the same as if I do the opposite way around. So if this gave me P, this will also give me P, right? And we'll see why this is crucial. Seems like a stupid thing to say, but it's actually very important. And the second is this weak transitivity, or this what he calls triangular inequality, right? Which is if I already gave you the measure for example, the red flag 2, the conjunction of it with the identity. So the two red flags, they have maximal identity in this world. We already defined this. Let's say we evaluated this. And then we already have the identity of the red flag 1 with a black flag. We know it's P. So we already know that whatever it is that we get when we evaluate the red flag 2 with the black flag, its value is constrained. So this is, let's say, how you disseminate some coherence in this measuring, right? Once you measured something and something else, if you now try to measure two of those elements that were inside of those two measurements, right, or participating in those two measurements, the first two measurements will give you some constraints on the third. And this particular constraint is that the ID here of the second flag with the black flag cannot be higher than the one of the first flag with the black flag, since the two flags, the two communist flags, are very similar. So you start to get more out of these by seeing that the coherence starts to appear, right? And what does this translate to for Badiou philosophically? It translates into a very weird claim, at least very kind of, I think it's the most serious claim that he makes in the beginning of this chapter concerning phenomenology and why this is objective phenomenology and not intentional phenomenology like Husserl or whatever. And he says, let's read this because I think it's worthwhile. He says, we can insert here a remark on objective phenomenology, which we have referred to several times as one of our methods, in which we have already distinguished from intentional phenomenology in the preface. So, somebody is listening to some music, I think. So he says, from a point of view of a supposed consciousness, so if this process was, let's say, appearing to a consciousness, one will say that the intentional act of discrimination between the group of anarchists and that of the Kurds must take place in a definite temporal order. A conscious gaze shifts from one to the other and recapitulates phenomenal difference, inscribing into language the temporalized movement of evaluation. If we suspend any reference to intentional consciousness, there only subsists the immediate veridicality of an evaluation of identity, of the kind, the group of Kurds and the group of anarchists are identical to the p degree. Right, should have some p here. This evaluation cannot retain any reference whatsoever to time or temporal order, for the chief reason that no time is implied in the transcendental indexing of the being there, which is a weird claim for a phenomenology, right? Time has only a parasite is only a parasite introduced by the metaphorical or didactic usage of vulgar phenomenology. Objective phenomenology comes down to suppressing this parasitism by retaining only the identitarian or differential result of the trajectory that is imputed to a consciousness. It will therefore settle on a determinate transcendental value in the world demonstration in the Place de la République for that which connects and differentiates the group of Kurds and the group of anarchists without it being possible to assign an order to this value. This can more simply put, the function of transcendental indexing is symmetrical, in that the value of identity of two beings there is the same, whatever the order they are inscribed. So his point, and this is, let's say, a weird way to go about it, is to say, I told you guys that if you compare the anarchists to the Kurds, or if you compare the Kurds to the anarchists, the value is the same, it's symmetrical. This means that, sorry, yes?
And this is because the temporal movement is irrelevant. Is he making a case for this symmetrical, this axiom by referring to the impact of the consciousness? Is he trying to make a case for the axiom?
Yeah, I think his point is, it might make sense to say that for a consciousness, first I measured the anarchists, and with regards to, let's say, the red flag, and then the Kurds appeared, and I measured the anarchists with regards to the Kurds. But he says that insofar the logic of the coherence of this space is not the logic of the acts of this came first with this, and then this came second. This temporal ordering doesn't affect the evaluation if I started with the anarchists with the Kurds and then I moved to the red flag. So if this was the first and this was the second, for example.
Yeah, if you take away the temporal ordering, the word of demonstration will be like a picture, that everything is fixed and you look at the final result.
Yes,
but,
kind of, because if you have an infinite picture, I mean, things start looking differently, right? I mean, again, I think that the difference between evaluating and measuring is very
no,
important.
I mean, it has to do with your original set in your diagram, that the word of demonstration in T1 has only elements A and B, but in T2 has elements A, B, and C.
Why? Which C?
Well, in T1, maybe chords haven't arrived. And then in T2, chords arrive.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
So,
I find this point rather obscure, this temporal business thing, because if you are assigning in transcendental values, you can always reassign them. You know, like you can start from the chords or can start from the anarchist, and then by inspecting the whole situation, you reassign them because the whole situation asks for it. Like you can revise it. I mean, I don't see how the temporal ordering will fundamentally change the transcendental indexing, other than if you didn't inspect the whole situation.
Actually, it does change. Temporal ordering does change. I just find this comment a little bit weird. I mean, I understand why he makes it, because he wants to differentiate between his phenomenology and naive phenomenology. But I think his comment is very, very difficult to work into this example. It does work for the picture, but in this example, let's say that the word of demonstration at T1 does not have any anarchist. At that time, the word of demonstration has a different transcendental.
I don't think so.
It does, because the world has changed. It's a different world. You have new elements.
No, but I don't think that.
It is like imagining the picture that you are building in the process. So if you have a painter who is painting the temple, and at time T1, there is no tree. At that time, if you just take a snapshot of that picture, it has a different transcendental, because there is no tree, there is no relationship between column and tree. But the painter goes back and comes and then starts painting the water and the tree. Now it's a different world altogether.
Yeah, but I think Badiou's point is, I think he's assuming implicitly here that time is like a part of a subjective thing.
I understand that,
and
I agree with him from that point of view. I'm just saying it's a very weird thing to say. It's very, it's not a very, doesn't seem to me a very thought out comment.
well, it's a Platonian. It's Plato, right?
Yeah, it's very Platonic but in a very precise sense, which is not to say everything is set in advance. And sure, you can introduce changes that change the transcendental, but you can also introduce changes that don't change the transcendental. I don't like the idea. I don't think you can make that direct claim you're making, Reza, that changes in this temporal order you meant, every change in it is a change in the transcendental. Because,
of course, it is not. Like, for example, when everybody gathers in the plaza, right? And there are various different events happening within that plaza, more or less the world is stable, right? And then the transcendental is stable. But as people start leaving the plaza, and now somebody opens the window, or you look at this world, is a different world than the one that was at 2 p.m.
Yes, but my point, what I want to suggest is that I think the structure of his argument is the following: that you actually get changes in a world affecting what he will call, let's say, we could call objective time. In the sense that, for example, this theory that he's presenting will help us understand why, for example, in revolutionary times, the temporal order seems to intensify to the point that minutes count, whereas in atonal kind of non-revolutionary moments, long passages of time are meaningless, right? We want an infrastructure for why it is that certain differences become very different, and at other points, these differences are indifferent. So the theory of differences and indifferences, it's actually a previous theory to the theory of, let's say, temporal differentiation, spatial differentiation, and so on. This theory is neither spatial nor temporal yet. So there is this is why objective phenomenology needs to have an account of order that is based on global coherence, and not based on temporal evaluation. Because yes, you're right, that some temporal evaluations will make a big difference. You're sitting at the corner, suddenly 1,000 people join.
I mean,
what was apparently...
It is unclear to me, this business about temporal evaluation, because first, I don't think that phenomenology works like that. I mean, once again, he's like bad mouthing other orientations. I think it's not like if I see one side of this of my cell phone in the table, everything will be changed once I integrate the whole object. It is not like that. Like there is a revision going on while you are adumbrating different sides of the same object, and this has something to do what he's saying. Like I'm reminded of an example. I don't know. Like I'm grading students. I'm correcting tests, right? So I can proceed in two different ways. I can like proceed like let me fix every grade as I go. Like, oh, this was good, this was bad. I'll give it like a 3. The other one was better. I'll give it 5. Then the other one was much better. I'll give it 7. And there's another way to go about it, which is to kind of have an ordered structure, and then you give the grades, right? So what he's talking about is like the result of the second operation for me. It's like, okay, you have the finished result. The finished result, the only difference is like he's platonically presupposing that the finished result will be, in a sense, inscribed within the situation already beforehand, right? But this has, I'm not sure if the temporal order wherein you see things will have any purchase upon the final result, which is different from the question Reza is asking, which is the difference within the world. Like something happens, something different happens, they introduce like a different thing. In my example, that would be something like, I gave 10 maximum to some test. Then I read another test and it's better than that one. So I have to reassign my transcendental values because something changed within the situation, right?
That's not reassigning a transcendental value. That's my point. That's measuring. That's not evaluation. You always use, let's say, an individual's probing into comparisons, local comparisons for a transcendental evaluation, and that's not what he means. Local comparisons are just measurings you're making, and they're probing into the evaluative space. So I agree with you that it's very complex what Husserlian phenomenology is doing, and revision and the logic of the project. It's very complex with the anticipatory and all this stuff. But I think that what he's getting at is that the questions that this machinery is answering are questions concerning, let's say, the infrastructure of what you said, not the process that you just described. So
yeah, but
why is it that, for example, if you're grading a high school paper, or let's say undergrad papers, and you assign maximums and minimums, you're defining the grades of every student, suddenly a student who is terrible, but you see he tried very hard, you cannot give him a proper number, because if you give him 10, you're lying. If you give him 0, you're not recognizing his value.
It's very common, in fact.
Yeah, so why is that? Why is it that that test was the one that put the process into crisis? That has nothing to do with the temporal order or with the revision. It has to do with something else. It's about
to do with an event. It changes the transcendent.
Yeah, exactly. So this is why he needs to start from before. So it's not undoing those questions, but it's not about those questions, I think.
I'm not arguing for changes that come about with the temporal ordering. I'm arguing for the opposite of that. I mean, it seems to me to be irrelevant, this thing about temporal ordering, because you, at the end of it, you get to a final result that is, you know, integrating all the results. So
yes, but that's still just a slice, a subset of the evaluative space. So the problem with the temporal synthesis is that it implies that it is synthesizing, whereas for Badiou, the synthesis already happened, and you're exploring the synthesis. So the distinction is, let's say, where is the coherence formulated? At the level of the world, or at the level of the finite set of inquiries into the world? Nothing guarantees that the finite set of inquiries, which I think is just what he means by temporal. Temporal means finite evaluations. The finite evaluations are not they are not the place where these constraints are put into motion or whatever, because these constraints will constrain what you get with this finite. So he wants to move it away from any sort of. It's not to say that there is no intentional consciousness, sure, but it will be walking around in a territory that is structured beforehand, even though it's not structured in another world of ideas. It's structured by the relation between these things.
I get the intent, and I like the way that you summarize it as the synthesis is already done. But I think this comment is weak from two standpoints, in my view. Standpoint number one is to equate temporal sequencing with a conscious eye, I think is too hasty, because he has not built any. So I get what Dennis is saying, that he's trying to differentiate himself from the subjective phenomenology, but the fact that temporal is equal to subjective is a little bit hasty. Like he has not yet dismissed temporal from objective phenomenology, or categorically equated temporal sequencing with consciousness effect. So that is number one. And number two is, it is hasty a little bit because the presupposition that the synthesis is done is a presupposition that in a lot of objective phenomenon in the world, that there is no consciousness existed, like physical phenomenon. That synthesis is very, very hard to make. And we know that they change very rapidly. So if this phenomenology is supposed to equally work for those phenomena, then presuming the synthesis in this way is a little bit too hasty. I think in general, because of these, I wouldn't put a lot of emphasis on this comment. I think I would have preferred that he did not make the comment, and use the examples such as books, and like, because book is that synthesis you're talking about. Page 361 and page 362 is all already synthesized. You know what I'm saying?
Kind of.
Yeah, I just mean, like, if he starts to introduce time, then you run into all sorts of problems. Like, you know, like a painting even, you don't ever see the painting all at once, right? You start looking at one spot and then your eyes move to another spot and so on. So every synthesis, any object whatsoever, is never taken in all at once.
That's exactly my point, because when he refers to temporal, he refers to temporal in the way that you just said. Temporal in the way that the word is being constructed itself.
Yeah. I think the point of what I wanted to make, it has something to do with this, because I think he may be he's granting too much to this temporal ordering. I think, like, it has the power to change the transcendental of sorts. I mean, my point, I think you are misunderstanding me. My point is not that the subjective transcendental is able to change everything. It is, at the end, it will arrive at an objective, at a kind of a mapping within its measuring of the objective transcendental, like with the example of the exams. Like, you are assigning grades, and then you get at a certain result, which is not necessarily equal to each different adumbration of the process, right? Which each you don't get to keep every grade as you gave them as you went along, right? So it seems to me that the comment is motivated by some kind of a worry that this process will necessarily change the result because of the ordering. And what I'm saying is that it seems to me to be irrelevant.
Yeah, that's what he says. No temporal order interferes with the evaluation. That's all.
No, that's not all, because he's attributing to, you know, let us call it traditional phenomenology, a process wherein you don't get to constitute an object because of the order wherein you constituted it. Like, this is not the case. Like, it is, I mean, it is methodologically important for, you know, certain phenomenology to keep track of time and you know, temporal adumbrations and all of that. But the end result of the constituted object, for the end result, this is kind of, for a certain class of objects, of course, if it's a temporal object like a song, like a symphony, it's not the case. But for certain kinds of objects, it is kind of irrelevant, the order wherein you get your adumbrations, right? So it seems that he's putting too much weight on this temporal ordering thing, and it is also motivated by a misreading. I think it is a misreading of sorts of the method of traditional phenomenology.
Yeah, well, I don't know. He calls it vulgar, meaning he's not talking about Husserl. He's talking about a more commonsensical idea. Second, he's trying to make clear, in my opinion, that to accept that when you ascribe transcendental degrees to this identity function, you're committing to relations that will maintain and continue to obtain no matter what else you are ascribing. So if you ascribe, for example, to the relation between Kurds and anarchists a certain degree R, if you now start analyzing something else with regards to the Kurd and its P, it will be constrained by previously measurements we made. So the logical constraints are something that are coming in a certain level of indifference to the unfolding of these measurements. So I think that's what
within, you know, a different framework like Persian or Salesian framework, is just that with your different measurements, you are converging at some objective values, right?
Não podemos mais e nem vamos ficar à margem disso. Oi, vocês estão me ouvindo?
Eduardo, acho que o seu microfone tá saindo som, cara.
Peraí, Nath, peraí. Tá modulando o som para você? Tudo normal. Oi, alguém?
Eduardo?
Para mim, o racismo é muito isso, entendeu? Da preta, no final.
Can't you mute the microphone?
Yeah.
Just trying to talk to him. So I just think that he's trying at this point to suggest that, well, if you accept this ID function, we're moving from punctual evaluations, right? So we're moving from one evaluation like this to the fact that this arrow here is actually preserving a certain coherence, so that it doesn't matter how you go about ordering this stuff, this mapping, a certain structure will be preserved.
Yeah, this is, yeah.
But that's not a small stuff. This is really big.
No, but this is big. But you know that. Oh my God, so much noise. What I was saying. But the weight that he puts upon the temporal ordering, I don't think temporal ordering, anybody's saying that the temporal ordering, others, I mean, not, at least not his opponents here, they're not saying that the temporal ordering will change the result. Nobody's saying. This is why I think this observation about phenomenology is kind of I don't understand why it is there in a sense. Of course, he should have said, as he said from the beginning of the book, this is objective phenomenology. This is not subjective phenomenology. The values, the transcendental values are there, and the measuring values, you can come up with them in a sense, because we are talking about this difference between evaluation and measuring. So with this, we have a space for, you know, what transcendental subject in the sense of Kantian, certain sense, brings over, like a measuring, kind of measuring scale, but the evaluation is already there. So, I mean, this is solved. You don't need to, I mean, I don't understand why this temporal stuff is so important, one. And I think it is important for a bad reason, for him. I mean, he thinks it's important for a bad reason, because he's misreading phenomenology. I mean, okay, you can add the predicate vulgar, what you're saying, but then nobody understands what you're talking about.
Really. My impression is that, I mean, the way I translate these two remarks is that the transcendental of a demonstration in the making is not dependent on the existence of a situated temporal and spatial person who evaluates. It just doesn't depend. I think that's the crucial part of it. That your inhabiting of this world is constrained by this structure rather than the other way around. I think temporal order, conscious subjectivity, or whatever you want to call, is a way of talking about. It's the first time in the book that he arrived at a point where he gave us enough conditions, conditions coming out of the necessity of coherence between transcendental degrees to be able to prove the point that, look, this requires a symmetry and a transitivity that makes it so that it's indifferent to your wanderings around this world. Hence, it's objective and not subjective. Like, I think that's the gist of it. No wonder it's a small argument. I like it because I think it's I don't find that he's so concerned with making the business against someone in particular. I think he's concerned with making the business about the qualification of objective. Objective means these constraints of the world are related to the world and not to your wandering in the world. So it's not concerned with how you recapitulate phenomenal difference, inscribing in language, temporalized movement of evaluation. So this embodied moving around the world will, at best, capture relations that, because they are symmetrical and respect transcendent this triangular inequality, they will have to be, let's say, they're constrained from the get-go, right? I think that's the gist of it. I think that it sounds less impressive because we were already looking for this from the beginning, but as a statement on phenomenology in general, I think it's relevant enough to warrant this remark. I don't think it would be better without it. I think it's, sure, for very, very fine-grained discussion of phenomenology, it's very superficial, but I don't see exactly it as a meaningless thing. I think it's.
How do you then account for phenomena that change very, very rapidly, objectively?
It depends. This is again the point. Like, we want to arrive at the theory of temporal change. We don't want to depart from it. So theory of temporal change is included later on, once we understand what, I mean, this can be translated into physical terms in terms of metastability of a system. Like for a certain boiling liquid with molecules and so on, you can have a certain metastability of the system so that if they're going a bit slower, a bit faster, if there's a bit more molecules, or if they evaporated a bit, the entropic level, nothing really changes, even though everything is changing at every microsecond. But at a certain tipping point, you have a singularity in the sense that a certain equilibrium is broken and things happen, right? How do we explain this without presupposing time? because we want time to be explained. We don't want time to be the explainer. For that, we need a theory where time is an effect, not time is the. So we want anti-symmetry, we want irreversibility to be a product of our theory. So our initial theory needs to be symmetrical and coherent, because that's the way we get to already talk about, let's say, all the things that can change here without anything changing, and how a very small difference can make a big difference. So we don't want to presuppose that and say, but perhaps something will come in and everything will change. No, we want to say, okay, what are the conditions for something to arrive or to change inside that change everything or change a lot or are measurable by the quality of time changing? We want to arrive at that. That's the theory of change from section book 5 or 6.
So that's good. I agree with that, but and I also think temporal temporal discussion has nothing to do with this level of logical discussion. But I think it is important that we differentiate two senses of temporal: objective temporal versus subjective temporal. He's making his comment here solely against subjective temporal without making a room for objective temporal.
No, I disagree. I disagree because the example I just gave you is objectively temporal, and it also respects the fact that depending on the transcendental, this transcendental, what counts as a unit of change is different. And this can be objective or subjective. It can be subjective in the sense of, I don't know, our experience and our private synthesis of stuff based on our own goings about, but it can be objective in the sense that the teapot and the boiling point and the threshold and metastability, all of that has nothing to do with subjective time. But still, this would apply.
Okay, so then I'm lost. Why you think that the objective temporal does not change the transcendental?
It can change, but that concerns.
That's what I'm saying.
But it can. But what says if it can or not? The transcendental, not the time. So we want to have a theory where theory of worlds is more general than a theory of both objective and subjective time, because then we can talk about under what conditions is objective temporal change meaningful and under which conditions it is not. I mean, this is something that, I mean, in both cybernetics, dynamic systems analysis and things like this, even like a very kind of avant-garde physics, I think it's, from what I understand, is already at stake, is the idea that, you know, that Bateson thing of a difference that makes a difference, right? What Badiou is doing is give you the general theory of differences so that you can deduce from this or have a general view of why in a particular case a certain objective difference made a difference or not. So why is it that from the standpoint of geological time, everything that happened for hundreds and hundreds of years doesn't really count as more than an instant, and suddenly what happened in the last 200, 300 years marked a new geological era? Why is a certain stability changed? Why is that the closing point of a unit?
No, I get that. I get that. My point is not that temporal transcendental is changed because of temporality. I'm saying that within certain parameters, the worlds evolve, and the evolution of the world changes the transcendental of that world.
Yeah, it can.
Now, right.
It can do so or cannot. For example, in the transcendental of I don't know, a laborer in the workforce, the day and night change in the day might be very meaningless because it's pretty much included in his daily, it's part of the work. It's rest to go back to work, right? Nothing guarantees what temporal change will be meaningful or will be a difference or not. So unless we already have an analysis of the constraints of a certain world, we won't be able to talk meaningfully about what temporal changes are relevant and which are not, or if certain, or in a certain sense, if temporality is relevant or not for certain worlds, right? So that's why it's good to have this step back and to consider this infrastructure something that precedes temporal disclosure, even if it might very well be the case that if you're painting the afternoon, the afternoon moves on. And then, and then you no longer can paint it, or it's a different painting, it's a different world altogether. But it depends on something. I think somebody asked a question I just saw here. So it's like a formal mapping of how parochial and global temporality relate. I'm not sure if I understand. AJ, could you elaborate?
I just felt lost on how if temporality changes transcendental, where does the temporality fit in? I mean, I was just lost on this front.
Yeah, I think that Badiou makes a big point of not having a general theory of time. So, for example, in his political analysis together with that Lazarus guy, they had all this project which was against time as a political category, saying that temporality appears inside, politics construct its own time. So, for example, for climate change, geological time is relevant. You need to count geological time. You need to count also the time of political urgency. And it's a big question for climate change, how to connect the time of urgency with geological time. That's how time gains concreteness, right? Whereas the idea that, well, we have these chronological lines that go from deep time and include our minimal time, that's not time for him. Like, that's just like a fiction or whatever. So for him, let's say temporality is an effect of worlds interacting and transforming and depends on the structure of worlds rather than the inverse.
But nevertheless, temporality is, nevertheless, transcendental conditions of that worlds are not exhaustive of that temporality, or is it? Because that was where I felt lost a little bit.
I see. Yeah, well, I'm not sure. I don't know how to solve this, but my impression is that it's almost like saying, sure, we have science produced an understanding of irreversible entropic time or deep time of geological time, and those things are relevant as scientific constructs, but that doesn't mean that they are, by the very fact that science talks about them, that they are always already structuring everything everywhere, because we don't know, we need to see. I mean, it's crazy in my opinion, and that's why I don't think this is so it's simplest in the way it's constructed, but it points to a very deep problem which is really weird. We're not accustomed to the idea because it sounds ridiculously Platonic, but in Badiou's view, it actually becomes ridiculously postmodern, if you want, because he's saying, I cannot know how time passes before I evaluate things locally. Like, sure, time is like the last resource of a global measure for worlds. You want to have the unfolding of worlds to be mapped onto this global scale, which is the temporal one. And Badiou doesn't want you to do that. He wants you to invert and begin with the analysis of world and then move to the temporal disclosure, even though certain worlds talk about the temporal disclosure of everything, ontological disclosure in deep time, for example. So it's weird, but it's also very profound to say time is the world time, after all, right? And then you ask, but what about the time between worlds? Well, if it's not a matter of expansion, it might very well be a matter of eternity. So
it seems that according to this, the order between the power of explanation between temporality and transcendental is in favor of transcendental.
yes,
You understand temporality because temporality is defined by the changes within the transcendental.
and you know, this is very Hegelian as well, because if you go to Hegel's theory of life, he says life is the entry of the idea in the world because it's the appearance of the interiorization of time in being. Rather than thinking things passing in time, you get the time of a thing, right? So the idea that the concept, time is the being there of the concept, right? You get actually a interiorization of this with Hegel, where ideas is precisely the name that he gives to how, let's say, things can acquire a metastability that gains supersession over time, right? It supersedes time in the determination. So
it is also, sorry, go ahead.
I remain myself even though I'm changing. So that's why that's already a transformation in the relation, right?
Right.
And
So
no wonder that to study things where this is not the case, so things where the idea is external to them, which for Hegel what inorganic life is, you need, like, let's say, the life of the inorganic for Hegel goes through science, whereas the life of a living thing goes through itself.
This actually reminded me a little bit of McTaggart after you bring up Hegel, because McTaggart has a kind of a similar argument as he's as a Hegelian about the unreality of time. So yeah, it makes a little bit more sense.
That's very. I never thought of connecting it to McTaggart's argument, but it's interesting in that sense. Yes.
Yeah.
It also matches matches what he has already said in Being an Event, that basically a theory of time should be built based on events, which
Exactly.
translated into this is the change in the transcendental.
Yes. So I mean, this is really profound. I mean, I totally agree that this is like not very fulfilling, but I do think that what's at stake.
The problem is not that it's not fulfilling. I think there's a categorical confusion there in that paragraph. Like, the problem is the time is not. I mean, he's conflating subjective and temporality. I mean, temporality can be more than that, and even subjective temporality. After you know, you integrate everything, you get a result that might translate the objective transcendental well. And this is, you know, this is kind of the approach that a Salarzian would take to this problem. What the difference, the basic difference is that, you know, from the standpoint of transcendental philosophy in the more traditional sense, like post-Kantian philosophy, like, you don't get to say what the consistency of the world is before inquiry, in a sense. And inquiry is tethered to language, but language adapts itself through time and converges upon a certain image of the things that are, right? So what I think there is a, of course, I'm not defending Salazar. I'm here to study Badiou with you guys, but my questions come from the standpoint of somebody that spent much more time, right, studying different philosophies than Badiou's philosophy. So this is why I think this idea that local time, like, will get you like different results, will get you a false result regarding the transcendental indexing. I think this is not the case. Like, you can get to a similar result from a different framework, wherein you don't get to presuppose the transcendental consistency, but you can construct it as a convergence within inquiry. So this is a different pathway to get to the same place, in a sense. I'm really sympathetic to this, actually, but I think there's a misrepresentation there of the more traditional transcendental way of putting things. This is, and there's a conflation of, you know, temporal and subjective. Like, it's not clear like what the relationship really is. Regarding the temporalities that are internal to worlds, I'm completely on board with that. As you know, I come from music, and my first research was in music, was in temporalities, and was within the idea, on the idea that different unfoldings, grammatical unfoldings of musical syntax, of relationship to sounds, give rise to different times, different species of times. So this is actually I feel very at home with this idea. And what I find most funny is that at that moment when I was composing this thesis and studying this, you know, internal time of each, you know, different proposition, static proposition, a teacher of mine, I was talking about, you know, vertical time, which is a species of time I was studying and conceptualizing at the time. And there was this teacher who told me, you know, Jean, music has to start and to end, right? Like, he completely misses the point that this is not, you know, the indexing of time points from the beginning to the end of a certain process that is of course occurring within let us say clock time, if we are using clock time and if you are viewing it from the standpoint of clock time. But the point is that internally to that unfolding, there is the emergence of a different species of time, right? And this is, of course, empirically, this has different caveats that has to be investigated, like psychological relationship that one can make between events within, you know, a musical discourse, a sound discourse, this kind of thing. But nevertheless, it was just a comment,
but I think that this, I mean, I think this is a very important comment, because the thing that I wanted to, just to conclude this remark with, is that I think the best way to understand what Badiou is doing is to realize that if you say that temporality concerns a world, you're generalizing for worlds something we accept for living beings. So a metaphor would be to say that the world is a living thing, where things relate and there is its inner clock, right? Of course, you cannot generalize it beyond organisms without having to generalize things quite a lot, because relations that are valid for organisms are not valid for manifestations of communists and anarchists in a demonstration. So you move, let's say, from organisms to organization, and you keep a broader view of what time means here. But what I find interesting is that you mentioned to your teacher that there is something like an inner time here, and she answered with a vulgar phenomenology. She said, "No, but there is a beginning and an end."
Yeah, that's a problem.
Yeah, but you would have to paste this paragraph that you didn't like from Badiou to her and say, "No, from your vulgar standpoint, there isn't."
No, but there's more in that paragraph than just that. This is I know you're joking with me, but I mean, there's more in that paragraph than just that. I mean, if he said, you know, clock time, you know, the indexing of moments within clock time from a subjective standpoint, okay, this is a different thing and a more precise formulation. But you know, this phenomenology, if you examine A before B and B before A, the result is different. No, it's not. It's not necessarily different. I mean, you have to afterwards.
He didn't say that though. He didn't say that for all phenomenology the result is different, and he's the first one to realize it is not.
Wasn't the symmetry? The symmetry was the point of the paragraph.
Yes, but it's not a matter of saying I'm the first one to say.
The symmetry is being broken because I mean there is an order to the inquiry. I mean I don't see why. This was my point from the beginning, because this I remember this paragraph. It appears within the discussion of symmetry.
Sure.
So I don't see how this has any traction upon the problem of symmetry, really. I mean, but because this is more specific. But I wanted to say that overall, I agree with what you. I mean, have different temporalities, the temporality of different. Overall, I do agree with this. I mean, this is not a problem for me. I'm just,
Yeah,
I'm just,
I just think what he's saying.
not doing the work he said he thinks it is doing. Like this is my main issue with this.
Yeah, I just
I
think
think
what he's,
I think it would have been more clear if he compared explicitly his understanding with other philosophers. I mean, maybe that's the missing part. More explicitly.
yeah, I agree. It's very condensed, and it makes us how to call it, a scarecrow of this interlocutor. But again, I think that the point is to say that a symmetric and triangular approach, like the one that he mentions in the next page, as let's say a structure that precedes temporal unfolding, it's something that is essential to an objective phenomenology. Like, to the point that arguments of the form, but you are constrained by a transcendental that's your transcendental, which is things need to unfold for you in a temporal order, does not substitute the temporal or the unfolding order or structure of the world you're. So it's not a matter of what are the powers of a subject, of an individual subject. It's just the fact that even if you do have a transcendental structure that requires you to see this first and this second, this is like your glasses. You're obliged to see things in this way. This is not a transcendental structure he's talking about.
Yeah, this is clear. This much is clear.
Yeah, but that's all he said. Like,
yeah,
this transcendental is not the transcendental of a consciousness that needs to see something first and something second. It's something else. That's what it is. It is something else. That's his point, I think.
Yeah, but when I read this paragraph, I was under the impression that he was saying, because it is connected with the business about symmetry, that because there is an asymmetry of inquiry to the inquiring, because you are inquiring A before B, so there's a temporal asymmetry. This would entail that this asymmetry will inform your transcendental indexing, and this transcendental indexing will be therefore asymmetrical. I don't see how this.
But look, it never says here anything about the fact that the subject.
No, it does not say, but it is in this context. So I was, why is temporal indexing? I mean, temporalized indexing relevant to the symmetry? I don't see how. But anyway, this is why I think I agree with Rez. I prefer this paragraph to not be there, because I think it creates confusion. But it's okay. I mean, I'm on board.
Yeah, I think there are 2 points here in this discussion. If I summarize, we understand that Badiou is not a philosopher of time. He doesn't have a philosophy of time, but he doesn't think that time is a very primordial concept in his philosophy. Now, he basically makes 2 arguments against the primordiality of time. One is a subjective time, which is he's against that because this is objective phenomenology. And the other one is the construction of time that he thinks that is based on the transcendental. The issue is that these 2 arguments are not symmetrical. They are banned from his philosophy, not banned, but pushed back in his philosophy for different reasons. And he's not doing an elaboration of those reasons here. We understand that his phenomenology is an objective phenomenology. So a consciousness is this point of view that he's making from a logical standpoint is not from a gaze or a consciousness that is looking at this. So we got this at the beginning. The sense that I was a little bit confused was he's making a general comment about temporality, and that general comment should be augmented with the fact that what Gabriel said, that there is, and this is completely true, that it is not temporality that has the explaining power. Temporality is a derived concept from within his system.
Yeah.
And that derivation takes place by tools that he's constructing right here.
The statement that I most agree with Caron on this passage is that this thing here that he just says here, I totally agree that this is what Russell does phenomenology comes down to suppressing parasitism of time and retaining identitary or differential results. This is what transcendental reduction, bracketing, suspension of the epoche or whatever already does.
It's there, you know. This stuff is there. I mean, yeah.
Yeah, but I don't think I don't think Russell is his
interlocutor.
Interlocutor. I think his interlocutor is what Meyasu calls a correlationist sort of position, where things only get constituted as objects if I am there for them to be constituted for me, and there is no there can be no global coherence principle for this synthesis to apply to, because this would imply that I have access to a non-subjective discourse, which I don't. Therefore, this can only locally cohere with my subjective apprehension. So I think that that's more what he's. I mean, ultimately, I mean, I think this is also something that is not very good in the text, but it's useful that there are mostly philosophers are on Badiou's side. Like most philosophers are against democratic materialism. Russell is not a democratic materialism for Badiou, and even though he thinks you need a more powerful machinery, he would at no point in the book does he suggest that he only has positive things in fact to say about the guy.
Can you type the name and the book in the comment section?
For which book?
The philosopher you're referring to.
Russell. I don't know how to pronounce his name, but you know the guy.
Yeah.
The worst name to pronounce.
Edmundinho, pô.
So okay, I mean it's already late. I think that it's a good place not to stop, because now we go into what a phenomenon is, and I think we have a better grasp now on how to go through it. But it's a quick part to discuss before we go into the phenomenal component and we get to our beautiful painting, which I reproduced here. So I think we can, I don't know what you guys think. Should we move to phenomenon in existence, or should we stop here?
Yeah,
I don't know. I mean, like, I'm okay till top of the hour, but if you think that this is a logical point to stop.
Yeah, I think it's an okay top. I mean, if we're only have another 15 minutes, I think it will be a bit too much to fit here. But I think it's perhaps better than moving on. It would be to, I think, stress this point that, I mean, besides this passage, right? Besides what he's written here, I think that to this issue we brought up regarding stability, equilibrium, physical systems, life and world and things like this. This is very, this is really important, because just to bring back to a discussion we had a couple of sessions ago, it's always weird to see Badiou talking about these things with this language that sounds very static and eternal, when we are so entrenched in trying to find out more about complexity, emergence, dynamics, becoming, right? And it seems very counterintuitive to be adopting a language so static to talk about transformation, right? So my point here, especially with Deleuze, because when we get to next meeting, I think that we have very interesting things to say about Deleuze when we get to the idea of atoms and real atoms. But I think that it's good for us to think about a bit why this is not it's counterintuitive for philosophy, but it's actually very, very cogent for everything else. A couple of meetings ago, I made a remark that I thought was a bit unclear concerning complexity, emergence, and axiomatics. And I think that it comes in handy here, perhaps, because I was saying that there has been, let's say, a trend in the last decades or so. I don't think you can even call it a trend that if it's been around for so long. But the idea is that if you have a system in something emerges in the system as a new phenomena that is irreducible to the things that you already knew about it. So something that emerges here, right? This idea that some sort of emergent stable property arises from a more ground or a more determinate system. It's very much, let's say, the cornerstone for complexity studies and nonlinear dynamics analysis and things like this. And it seems like you're always closer to thinking this phenomena if you have a way of describing systems where they are all about change and dynamics, so that you can talk about, let's say, attractors. Oh my God, I already attractors or equilibrium points, or you can talk about singularities, catastrophe, or whatever, right? And I was talking to Caron about this, and I realized that Badiou's approach to Gödel's theorems is very telling of his general approach to complexity, because the whole problem there was that you get a certain system that there comes a time where the propositions which are they're true in the system, so they do obtain for this system, but you cannot prove them. You cannot derive them. Okay, this is crazy that I wrote it like this. Okay. But you cannot derive P, right? So this is like, oh my God, there is something which is part of S, which is this statement P, but I cannot derive it with the machinery that I have available for me. So it's not provable, but it's true. So what is let's say the general approach to this is to say, well, if I had a better understanding of S, if I change my description to a more dynamic description of it, I'll be able to capture the information needed to describe P. But this is a very simple definition of complexity, right? That you have certain statements in your system that are true, but they cannot be derived with the resources you had in the origin. So you have some stuff about molecular behavior, and you get a general stability in the system that it's, even though it's true, you cannot derive it from simply the statements you can make about the molecules. So generally, this sort of situation of minimal, like the basic complexity, suggests that the correct way to approach something emerging here is to give it a dynamic instead of a static description. Whereas Badiou substitutes dynamic description, so this sort of complexity approach to stuff, for an axiomatic approach. Because how is another way of solving this? Is to add an axiom here so that now you can derive P. You say if axiom, then now P becomes a theorem. So rather than get into a sort of almost metaphysical quibble over what is the basis of this, is it static or dynamic, but you opt usually for this axiomatic approach. So rather, you would say, oh, we had the wrong definition of a particle. If particles can produce emergent phenomena, we need a dynamic description. Rather than do this, but you will say, if you add something to the system, as Gödel can do, if you augment, for example, Peano's axioms to include some large cardinals in it, suddenly those things which weren't provable are now provable, right? So this is a weirdly static way to account for emergence, complexity, change. Because you actually change the parameters through axioms rather than simulate stuff without adding any more information in order to arrive at what you cannot derive. So the reason why I'm bringing this into the picture now is that I think that it actually connects to the temporal and worldly discussion we were having. To assume that you need time as a primitive in order to account for change is because you are assuming that you have a world, and if things emerge in this world, a new phenomena here that changes, that is not indexed to an old transcendental, is a new transcendental, it's not expressible with the old resources you have. The best way to describe this is through simulation. It's through imagining this dynamic unfolding as the causal principle. Whereas Badiou prefers to imagine this as a world plus another axiom and keep the logical description separate from time. So then this phenomena is no longer emergent in a complex sense. It's something else, right? So I think that ultimately, as we go along, we'll get a more clear machinery as to why my impression, at least, I'm not sure if this makes sense to you guys, why you can substitute this sort of complex approach to stability, to transcendental conditions, and so on and so forth, for something that combines axiomatics and scales, and this categorical approach. But
I think somewhere there you have to insert the model as well, the concept of model or model-driven proofs, as opposed to
sorry guys, something is going on with my computer. Reza, could you say that again?
Right. Somewhere in that discussion, I think it is important both for Badiou for sure, is as opposed to proof theory, we insert somewhere in that explanation the model theory. So instead of proving by providing a proof or a derivation, we basically construct a model in which a particular statement is true within that model.
Mm-hmm.
This may also actually solve a couple of problems with complexity theory, because complexity theory sometimes approaches various kinds of ineffability, not always, but sometimes. So this way of thinking may solve some of those problems as well.
Yeah, I do agree with Matteo. Matteo is saying here that these are not excluding approaches. Of course, you can simulate dynamics first and then try to find a new axiom and introduce it into the static model. Yes, but you see the very fact, I mean, what I'm trying to show is that the fact that you can add an axiom and make an emergent property back into a regular property, so to speak, right? It says something about the precedence of transcendentals over time. That you had the restriction that simulation was the only way to arrive at the comprehension of the phenomena. Not the phenomena had that restriction. So it's interesting that in complexity theory and biological studies and so on, sometimes we feel that because the formal approach requires simulation because of dynamic approaches, that this gives time a more profound role to play. But the fact that this is equivalent, as Matteo said, sometimes you can actually substitute one for another. They're not, one is idealistic, the other materialistic, because one didn't include more primitives than the second. In fact, Badiou's model is neither static nor dynamic, right? That's the crazy part. It's static in the sense that, yes, there is a stability until the point that there is not. A world is what it is until it is not. Being is alive until it is dead, and while it's alive, it is what it is, right? But the crucial part is that the theory of the cohesion of that system is separate from it, how it unfolds. It can be tied together for us. So I'm just trying to bring that phenomenology argument concerning subjective and objective time to a more scientific context, right? And I think complexity theory is a place where this argument is actually very powerful, because we have the impression, it seems to me, and I think that this underlies a lot of this sort of computational approach as a constructive approach, that if you take the simulating route and therefore spouse dynamics as a sort of metaphysics for you, where things are always in movement, that you are following the phenomena more closely somehow. I don't know how to explain this, but I just wanted to throw this weird discussion out there because I think it might become more relevant as we go along. And I know Mateus studied a lot of stuff concerning complexity and so on. I just wanted to clarify that there is actually a very strong correlation or equivalence in a certain sense between Badiou's approach and a lot of methods in complexity theory. But the fact that he presents things like this is not to suggest that this doesn't have a lot of connections with the life sciences and things like this. On the contrary, I think it's even more cogent, perhaps, to, for example, that guy, my hero there, Robert Rosen's approach, or even some stuff people are doing today more recently, like Longo and other guys, trying to downplay this complex analysis and find other ways to arrive at what makes a certain living world cohere the way it does, right? The idea that to discuss the coherence of a world is to discuss the genesis of it, its emergence as coherent. It's not necessarily, it's both sometimes equivalent to the axiomatic approach, and sometimes it's less powerful even. So yeah, I'm trying to give a shout out to Mateus, and I know he's studying this, and I thought that this was an interesting parallel. Just because we discussed very briefly the Hegel and life and things like this. So I do think that this is enough of a approach to also be transposed there without losing much, you know?
I mean, this also makes clear, there was one quote of Badiou from Praise of Mathematics where I was a little bit confused by, where he says, mathematical formalism thinks ahead of time. So now it makes more sense in my head what he was trying to say there.
Yeah, I mean, there is this problem, right? That mathematics, sometimes you develop stuff much earlier than it's actually used. I'm not sure if the context was the fact that mathematics is disposable, like it's available until the moment that it's useful. I'm not sure, or if he was actually talking about, let's say, the interiority of mathematical time, which is also the world of mathematics has its own. I think that this could be really, really interestingly developed as well. I don't know if you guys are aware of Emmanuel Wallerstein's theory of world systems, where he talks about, he is very much in conversation with Brodel and the whole discussion on world time and the sort of different times of long duration versus the urgent times of political affairs, right? And I think that it's nice to have this structure developed in such a broad formal way, because you can very nicely go back to their approach. There is a French philosopher who works a lot with Simondon, who is trying to use this idea of different time scales that are connected somehow inside the same system, exploring it very nicely. And so, I don't know, I think that there's a lot of stuff to do there as well, you know? Very, very interesting field of problems.
What is the name of the French philosopher that's working with Simondon?
Yeah, I mentioned him, and then I remembered that I don't know his name. Let me see if I can remember. It's Vincent something. Oh my God, okay. What is the guy's second name? Let me see if I can find it here. If you...
Damn, that's a nice studio, Tony.
Let me just see. I think I have it here. Yeah, Vincent Bontemps. Let me write it here. He has a text called The Actuality of Historical Epistemology. It's a French text. Vincent Bontemps.
Thank you.
Yeah, anyway, I think it's a good place for us to stop because this way we ease our way into atomic logic next time. But I just think that for today, besides that initial discussion on category theory and post sets and stuff and Stone's duality or whatever, it's useful just to see that the way he approaches the function of appearing is in such a way that we are finding logical constraints onto the further indexing of multiples, right? So once we assume that a transcendental exists, we're starting to move to the interior of the world and see that symmetry and triangular inequality, as he calls both these properties, they will constrain the coherence of what comes to appear inside. So it's the beginning of that process I mentioned in last time and this time again, that the book is gonna like look into the inner relations of the world based on the local relations, right? So we can start to see that once something was if something is evaluated in some way, if you introduce something new, well, it's already constrained by that logical space on what value it might come to assume, right? So that's already an addition to the machinery, considering the previous chapter.
Yeah, I think we should mention that we are having our meetings on Tuesdays next week, right?
Ah, yeah, we're moving to Tuesdays next week. Yeah, that's part.
Yeah, so everybody knows now.
I just realized that the philosopher's name that sounded so weird to me, you were saying, is Husserl.
Yes, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Okay, guys.
Okay.
Sleep well. See you
You
all.
too. Thank you.
Bye-bye.